Poland is becoming an intimidating military force in Europe, and it's making Putin sweat a lot, and with good reason. Here's the situation. The balance of power in Eastern Europe is changing rapidly. Russia, the traditional leader in the region, is in decline. Poland, on the other hand, is rapidly gaining strength. In 2023, it is at its strongest standing in the European balance of power since the days of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in the 17th century, and is currently engaged in a large military buildup that would see it create the strongest fighting force on the continent. For Russia, this poses even more problems than those it has already dealt with in its weakening geopolitical standing. A strong Poland all but guarantees to put a hard limit on Russia's geopolitical ambitions in Eastern Europe and the Baltic Sea. Might we be seeing the beginnings of a purported Thucydides trap scenario in Eastern Europe, where a rising Poland causes fear in the Russian leadership about potentially being displaced as the ruling power in the region? If war did break out, would the Russian military be able to conquer Poland on its own? Let's take a look at the balance of power in Eastern Europe and the Baltic, and how well Russia would do against a much better armed Poland. Poland and Russia have a long history of warfare, with each prevailing over the other on numerous occasions. After the end of the Cold War and the fall of the Soviet Union, Poland went on a spree of breakneck economic growth and joined NATO in 1999. Starting in 2014, Poland began a military buildup. The country had previously been under the NATO guidance of spending 2% of GDP on defense, but in 2022, it spent 2.6% on its military, by NATO estimates. It is increasing its defense spending too. In 2023, it structured its national budget to spend 4% of GDP on its military, making it one of the biggest defense spenders in NATO per capita. Poland can afford this. It has been Europe's biggest economic success story of the 21st century, with an average annual GDP growth rate of almost 4% since the end of the Cold War in 1991. In a generation, Poland has gone from an impoverished communist vassal state to a budding great power. That Poland would increase its defense spending and military ambitions since 2014 is no coincidence. It was the year when Russia intervened in the Ukrainian Maidan unrest, illegally annexed Crimea, and carved separatist territories away from Kyiv's control in the Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts. The Poles, who have a long historical memory, understood what Russia was up to and prepared for a potential confrontation. As a result, the Polish military is now far more capable than it was even a few years ago. In the recent past, Poland has been using Soviet-era equipment that the Russian military also uses and is accustomed to dealing with. Such equipment includes tanks like the T-72 main battle tank and the fourth-generation MiG-29 fighter jet. However, Poland is now slowly but steadily getting rid of this equipment, often through donations to the Ukrainian military. It is instead acquiring and training its soldiers to use modern equipment, especially from the United States and South Korea. This new equipment includes an initial order of 32 fifth-generation F-35 Lightning II fighter jets to be delivered between now and 2030. Poland has also ordered 48 South Korean Fa-50 light combat aircraft, which can operate in air-to-air or air-to-ground scenarios, and is ideal for helping transition Polish pilots to the F-35. For closer air support, Poland has purchased 96 American AH-64E Apache attack helicopters. Meanwhile, to defend its skies, Poland is purchasing $5 billion worth of American Patriot air defense missiles and $2.4 billion worth of British CAM air defense missiles. Poland's investment in creating a modern air force and air defense system would pose the first big problem for Russia in any renewed Russo-Polish hostilities. Russia has been unable to establish air superiority in Ukraine, and Ukraine had a much less capable air force and air defense network than the ones Poland is now acquiring. Military experts expect that Russia will have about 24 of its newest fighter jet, the fifth-generation Su-57 Felon, in service by the start of 2024. In 2019, Putin announced plans to have a fleet of 76 of these planes in the Russian Air Force's fleet by 2028. However, international sanctions placed on Russia for its invasion of Ukraine threaten those plans because it is now much more difficult for the Russians to acquire the high-tech components needed for their construction. The existing Su-57s have seen service in Ukraine, but British intelligence reported that such service has been limited because Russian officers fear losing these planes in operations. For an operation against Poland, the Su-57 would come in direct combat with the F-35. in the first ever encounter between two fifth-generation fighter jets. The Su-57 is faster, with a top speed of about 1,500 miles per hour, compared to the F-35's 1,200. It also has a longer range, with a combat radius of 930 miles, compared to the F-35's 590. The Su-57 is designed to be more maneuverable than the F-35, thanks to its forward-swept wing design. However, the F-35 is harder to detect by radar. The biggest advantage that Polish pilots would have over the Su-57 is the number of planes that they have. Because of sanctions, development of additional Su-57s for Russia may prove impossible, while Poland can continue to expect more F-35s in its air fleet. The longer Russia waits, the more its disparity is likely to grow. The Russian air fleet is much bigger than Poland's as a whole, with 4,036 aircraft between its army and navy as of 2023. In comparison, the Polish Air Force has only 275 planes in service. In an all-out assault, Russia should theoretically be able to overwhelm the Poles through numbers, but the fact that it could not do this in Ukraine raises questions about whether the Russians would be able to establish air superiority against a more capable force, and with time, the number and ability of Poland's aircraft will grow in comparison to Russia. The same principle also applies on land. Poland is in the process of creating a vast army. It has plans to nearly double the size of its army to 300,000 active duty personnel by 2030. Which would make it the largest fighting force in Europe. The Polish public supports this move. Enlistments in the Polish military have spiked since Russia invaded Ukraine. As of 2023, the Polish army has about 189,000 total personnel. The Russian army is much bigger, with 3.6 million total personnel. Whether now or in 2030, the Poles would be significantly outnumbered in a Russian invasion. Experts believe that between 100,000 and 200,000 Russian troops are stationed in the Baltic enclave of Kaliningrad, which is also home to Russia's Baltic Fleet and hosts nuclear weapons. The presence of Kaliningrad poses serious geostrategic problems for Poland. The heavily fortified enclave is only 240 miles north of Warsaw. Kaliningrad also sits a mere 40 miles away from Belarus's western border. This stretch of territory is called the Suwalki Gap, and military experts consider it the most vulnerable position in NATO's territory. A Russian offensive westward from Belarus and eastward from Kaliningrad across the Suwalki Gap would, if successful, cut Poland off from its NATO allies Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. While those three Baltic states would suffer the worst for it, a successful operation across the Suwalki Gap would deprive Poland of some supplies and military options. Meanwhile, a drive southward from Kaliningrad toward Warsaw would force Poland into a defensive operation to protect its capital. Numerically superior Russian forces would also be far more heavily concentrated in a Polish campaign than they had been in Ukraine, which is much vaster territory. The dispersal of Russian forces across such a large area was one of the reasons why the Russian advance at the start of the war did not come as rapidly as outside observers originally predicted. Poland, with its more compact size, would not have the same luxury. Most of the fighting would take place along the narrower axis between Kaliningrad and the Belarusian border. Belarus's cooperation would be needed in these operations, but for all intents and purposes, it is a Russian vassal buffer state, and leaked Russian documents from early 2023 suggest that Moscow aims to annex Belarus by 2030. While Belarus did not intervene directly in the war in Ukraine, it hosted troops that attacked Kyiv, and it currently hosts over 9,000 Russian troops. With plans to build even bigger bases, Belarus would be forced to host Russian troops for an invasion of Poland if the Kremlin really wanted to undertake the operation. Poland therefore has significant geographical vulnerabilities that would aid the attack from Russian forces which outnumber them. Theoretically, this should mean that Russia can take very heavy casualties in a drive on Warsaw from north and east and still win. One Ukrainian soldier fighting against the Russians in Donbass in March 2023 said the following: "The Russian mobilizational reserve is pretty much infinite, which means that they have the luxury to make mistakes. They can lose a brigade, or they can lose a platoon, and some of those people are going to survive, and they can share experience with the new conscripts. If Russia were to bring its full national might into the war effort, with different waves of mobilization, the Poles' numerical disadvantage would become more pronounced." Poland's population, according to its 2022 census, is about 38 million. Russia's is about 147 million. However, as we've seen in Ukraine, the total number of personnel in the military does not equally translate to combat power on the battlefield. Russia's logistical problems were apparent from the earliest days of the war in Ukraine. when it was operating on the border of its own territory. Russian logistics for a war against Poland would be even more stretched. The supply lines would be longer, as they would need to go from the vast Russian interior, concentrate in Belarus, and then make their way to Poland. Waterborne supply lines from St. Petersburg to Kaliningrad would be shorter, but the balance of power in the Baltic currently greatly disfavors Russia. The Baltic, for all practical purposes, has become a NATO lake, especially with Finland's entry into the alliance and Sweden's entry pending. These maritime supply lines would be quickly disrupted in the event of a Russian war with Poland, even in the extremely unlikely scenario that NATO does not honor Article 5 commitments. Russian forces operating from Kaliningrad would therefore be difficult to supply unless the Russian offensive can create a land bridge from there to Belarus. Such a scenario would give Poland the opportunity to concentrate vital resources to prevent the Russians from achieving their objective. Destroying Russian supply lines and command and control centers would slow the advance down and give Poland more time to mobilize and counterattack. Fortunately for Poland, there are weapons on hand which would help in this strategy. Undoubtedly, military officials in Warsaw had it in mind when embarking on their arms buildup. As of March 2023, Poland has purchased 18 HIMARS rocket artillery systems from the United States. Poland plans to increase the number of HIMARS in its arsenal to 500 units. Ukraine has used HIMARS to devastating effect against Russian forces. HIMARS is a highly precise delivery system, and attacks on key assets like ammunition and fuel depots, command and control stations, and other supply routes crippled Russian positions and allowed the Ukrainians to retake vast swathes of territory in the late summer and autumn of 2022. HIMARS can come with a magazine of 6 MLRS rockets, most notably the M31 GMLRS Unitary, which can hit targets up to 70 kilometers away. Poland's HIMARS, however, will be even more capable, because the Poles have made an initial order of 45 ATACMS missiles. These munitions have a range of 300 kilometers and would offer the Poles excellent options in striking critical Russian targets. Presumably, staging points in Kaliningrad and Belarus would be a high priority for Poland's HIMARS systems and ATACMS missiles, especially since the enclave would be difficult to resupply by sea. ATACMS can reach that far, and Poland would not hesitate to use its missiles in this way. The damage Ukraine did to Russia with only a few dozen HIMARS systems and without ATACMS missiles would pale in comparison with what the Poles could do with many more such systems and the longer-range ammunition. Poorly organized and supplied Russian forces, which would need to operate further from their own territory to begin with, would prove ripe targets for a hail of HIMARS fire. And HIMARS is not the only modern rocket artillery system that Poland is getting its hands on. To supplement HIMARS, Poland is purchasing the South Korean K239 Chunmoo MLRS platform. The first batch of 18 of these arrived in Poland in 2023, and the Poles plan to increase the size of the force to 288. The Chunmoo, which was designed to counter long-range North Korean artillery, can fire several types of unguided rockets, with ranges between 30 and 45 kilometers, guided rockets that can hit targets 80 kilometers away, and a ballistic missile capable of strikes up to 290 kilometers. The Chunmoo launchers would put further pressure on Russian supply lines and communications. In Ukraine, the Russians have adapted to HIMARS by placing their critical assets further behind the front lines. They would try to do this in a Polish campaign too, but Poland will have longer-range weapons between ATACMS and the Chunmoo-launched missiles. Additionally, Russian supply lines will be longer, with less room for dispersal of critical assets because of the more compact front that would come from a military confrontation between Poland and Russia. This is where Russia's numbers might wind up working against it, as more troops would be concentrated and vulnerable to rocket and missile attacks. The Russians have also shown poor signal security in Ukraine, which led to many HIMARS attacks on important targets. The Russian military has a poor command structure and doctrine, with centralized control that discourages initiative in junior officers and aggregates decision-making to commanders further from the front. MLRS attacks on supply lines and communication hubs would therefore slow the Russian advance into Poland considerably, with confused masses of Russian officers being unsure about how to act when not in communication with their superiors. In contrast, Poland's command structure should be far more nimble and adaptive thanks to superior NATO doctrine, and better protected against the problems that come from a top-heavy organizational structure. Heavy rocket and missile attacks against Russian forces trying to establish a land bridge from Belarus to Kaliningrad would probably prove effective in slowing the Russian advance, raising Polish morale, and causing chaos in the Russian command. Poland is also investing heavily in modern tanks to further bolster its ground fighting capability. 250 M1A2 Abrams, 116 M1A1 Abrams, and 1,000 South Korean K2 main battle tanks are on the way, while the Poles are slowly but surely shedding their stockpile of older Soviet-era tanks like the T-72. The Poles are often donating this equipment to the Ukrainians. Meanwhile, Poland's current arsenal also has more than 240 Leopard tanks, which would find themselves comfortable among the modern American and South Korean tanks set to arrive. Poland also plans on having a fleet of 1,000 of its native Borsuk infantry fighting vehicles, which are being designed to work alongside the incoming K2 tanks. In total, the Poles' armored forces will dwarf anything else in Europe. For a country that has long prided itself on its armored forces, the Russian tank units have done poorly in Ukraine. Almost 2,000 tanks have been destroyed or abandoned there. Russia has also been hesitant to deploy its supposed latest and greatest tank, the T-14 Armata, in Ukraine. In early September 2023, it withdrew the few Armatas there, after supposed successful tests. The Russians might not have any choice but to be less hesitant with the Armata in a hostile encounter with Poland. Unfortunately for Russia, there are only a small number of Armatas in service. A test batch of about 40 was available in 2021, far short of the 2,300 the Kremlin said it would have by now. Such claims were made a decade ago. Even if the tanks are as good as the Russians say, and there is good reason to believe that they are not, there are too few Armatas to affect the course of a conflict. And with Western sanctions in place for the long haul, it's unlikely that Russia will be able to build up enough of the tanks to give it an advantage over the modern tanks Poland is acquiring. The Russian tank force still dwarfs the size of Poland's in sheer numbers. Russia fields significantly more tanks than any other country, up to about 12,600. However, only about 2,600 of those are main battle tanks, and only about a quarter of those 2,600 are the T-72B3 B3M, T-80B VM, and T-90 AM tanks that have modern fire control and sighting systems. Additionally, those are 2021 figures. Russia has lost many of its best armored assets in Ukraine since then. These tanks will be difficult for Russia to replace thanks to sanctions. Russia can break its archaic tanks out of storage, as it has been doing in Ukraine, but these would be cannon fodder for armored wave attacks to overwhelm the Poles through sheer numbers. On a narrow front, those numbers matter, even though the Russians would take terrible casualties. Russia's ace in the hole may be its preponderance in artillery. The Russian army has always traditionally been an artillery-centered fighting force. The Russian Artillery Corps has about 6,000 gun and rocket systems as of 2023. Poland is modernizing its gun systems with plans to purchase 600 South Korean K9A1 self-propelled howitzers that can hit targets 34 miles away. Russia would have more artillery than Poland in any scenario. But despite what they report about their artillery having one of the world's best fire control systems, Russian gunners are often poorly trained, inaccurate, and following bad doctrine. The result is many wasted shots. This is why, despite their firepower advantage, the Russians have suffered many reverses in Ukraine and have been unable to translate their artillery superiority into decisive victories. There is no reason to believe it would be different in Poland. The narrower front might mean greater luck for Russian artillery, but Polish gunners would almost certainly be more accurate shot for shot than their Russian opponents. In a war on Polish territory, Russia would have numerical superiority in the air and on land. With enough dedication, the Russians could try to overwhelm the Poles with its sheer mass of personnel and firepower, but this would be a costly strategy, reminiscent of the Winter War of 1939-1940, where the Red Army's wave attacks resulted in it suffering as many as 10 times the amount of casualties Finland took. The rapid modernization of Poland's military, Russia's long supply lines and logistic problems, and poor doctrine and command structure mean that something similar could happen in a renewed Russo-Polish war. This would be the most probable scenario. Russia may win if it puts its full effort behind the invasion, but its ability to project further power would become crippled in the process. Or perhaps Russia's logistics and command would be so weak and Poland's forces so much more effective that Russia gets stopped in its tracks, as it did around Kyiv, when its supply lines were inadequate, even though the distances involved were much shorter than would be the case in a Polish campaign. But what do you think? What would a war between Russia and Poland look like? Let us know in the comments. Don't forget to hit the like button and be sure to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. Poland's military has been going through a massive transformation. possibly resulting in it becoming the next #1 military superpower in Europe. And it's making Putin's blood run cold. After centuries of domination by foreign powers, Poland freed itself from communist rule in 1989 and joined NATO a decade later. This was a critical turning point not only for NATO but for Poland itself, heralding the start of a new era in Warsaw's international relations. Long the plaything of great powers like Germany and its predecessor state Prussia, Austria, and Russia, which had partitioned its territory several times and oppressed its people in numerous, brutal ways, Poland is now on the fast track to becoming a great power itself. In the year 2023, Poland is stronger than at any point since its glory days in the 17th century, when the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth dominated much of Eastern Europe, and it is getting stronger still. Let's take a look at this incredible evolution. How is Poland transforming itself into a great power, and what does it mean for that country, Europe, and the world? The entrance of Poland into NATO was a major geopolitical advantage to the alliance. During the Cold War, the alliance struggled to contain the Soviet Union, as it and its satellite states in the Warsaw Pact stretched westward all the way to central Germany. If it so desired to move further west, NATO's forces on the European continent would be outnumbered, and the communist forces could all concentrate on a narrower front in the European plain. Poland's accession to the Western Bloc completely reversed this geostrategic situation. It was now the new, post-Soviet Russian Federation that faced the geographical disadvantage, as NATO's forces could concentrate and Russia had a much broader area of the European plain to defend should war break out. Poland's accession to NATO also cut Russia off from much of the Baltic Sea, as its coastline forms part of the natural choke point with Sweden, which in 2023 also had pending NATO membership. Put simply, on land and sea, Poland's joining NATO was one of the biggest geopolitical and geostrategic disasters for Russia after the end of the Cold War. However, Poland is no mere passive player in the alliance. It does not contribute to the free rider problem in NATO that President Obama lamented in a 2016 interview with The Atlantic, and his successor President Trump repeatedly brought up in bellicose ways in order to try and get NATO members to pay more. Poland actually carries its weight in NATO's collective security. As of July 2023, it has spent 2.42% of its GDP on defense, well above the 2% benchmark that the alliance considers its standard. This makes Poland NATO's third largest defense spender by GDP, after Greece at 3.76% and the United States at 3.47%. Poland increased its defense spending from just under the 2% benchmark in 2014 to the current 2.42% over the course of a decade. Undoubtedly, this was done primarily in response to a more aggressive Russia from 2014 onward. The Poles have a long historical memory and do not want to be the subject of Russian domination ever again. Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine strengthened that resolve in Warsaw. Poland's relative level of defense spending compared to Germany's estimated 2022 total of 1.44% has even prompted many American lawmakers to propose strengthening the United States military ties with Warsaw at the expense of Berlin. Some American policymakers have floated the idea of moving most of the 35,000 US military personnel in Germany further east into Poland. A 2020 reshuffling of some American troops from Germany to Poland during the twilight days of the German skeptical Trump administration was a potential preview of that process. Poland plans to do more too. It has increased its defense spending to 4% of GDP in its 2023 budget. This would have it surpass Greece and the United States as the largest per capita military spender in NATO, and put it at a level over twice that of many other longtime NATO members, such as France, Germany, Italy, and Spain. As the quantity of Poland's military spending has gone up, the quality has gone up too. It can afford to spend a hefty amount of money on top-of-the-line military equipment because Poland has enjoyed breakneck economic growth compared to the rest of Europe. It's one of the 21st century's underreported miracle stories. Indeed, since liberalization began in 1989, Poland has experienced more economic growth than the highly touted Asian tiger countries like Taiwan, Singapore, and South Korea. In effect, Poland has been the tiger of Europe in the post-Cold War era. Between 1989 and 2015, Poland's GDP per capita based on purchasing power more than doubled and reached 65% of the level seen in Western Europe. It was the highest absolute and relative level of wealth in that country since the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, according to the Brookings Institution. As of 2023, its GDP per capita is about $19,000. Since 1991, Poland's total nominal GDP has grown by 126.35%, with an annual average growth of 3.94%. Tellingly, Poland did not go into recession in the financial crisis of 2008-2009, unlike the larger European Union, which shrank by 4.5%. Poland's economy instead grew by 4.2% in 2008 and 2.8% in 2009. While the so-called PIGS countries, Portugal, Ireland, Italy, Greece, and Spain, struggled with the debt crisis and austerity measures at the time, Poland continued ahead with its economic growth. The Polish economy shrank by 2.02% in 2020 at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, but it weathered the viral storm better than many other countries, and bounced back incredibly strongly with a 6.85% growth rate in 2021. All of this speaks highly of the robust and diversified economy that Poland has created in its modern, post-communist era. Poland still places modestly in an absolute ranking of the world's economies, especially compared to its NATO peers. It has the world's 21st largest economy in GDP by 2022 dollars, with a total of $688 billion. Still, the country's economic growth has been such a success story that some observers have estimated it will have a larger economy than the United Kingdom by 2030 if its current trajectory continues. Already by GDP per capita at purchasing power parity, major cities in Poland like Warsaw, Poznan, Kraków, and Wrocław are much richer than cities in the United Kingdom like Birmingham, Manchester, and Liverpool. Although Poland's total GDP per capita still significantly lags the United Kingdom at $46,000 for the Poles, the trend is their friend. Their current GDP per capita is almost 11 times higher than it was in 1990, when it was only at a level of $1,731. The days of food shortages and lack of other basic necessities that the Poles experienced under communist rule, particularly in the 1980s, are long gone. The country's prosperity can be measured in another way too. After it joined the European Union in 2004, hundreds of thousands of Poles left Poland to seek opportunity in the United Kingdom, which, as a fellow member of the European Union back then, was easy for them to do. Now the situation has turned on its head, as Poles who immigrated to Britain are now emigrating and returning home for better opportunities than the sluggish British economy can afford them. The Polish government is keen to hurry the process along. Its finance ministry has created a program called the Polish Deal, which offers a 0% income tax for the first 4 years to Polish émigrés who decide to return home. But Polish expatriates are not the only people seeking a better life there. The situation has reversed so much that many British and other Western European expatriates are moving into Poland, often commenting highly about the good standard of living and economic opportunity there for an affordable price. Poland's economy has become a hotbed for technological innovation and manufacturing, and it has one of the most highly educated workforces in Europe, with about 1 in 2 young Poles having achieved a post-secondary education. Foreign tech companies like Google and Microsoft are opening data centers in Poland. Meanwhile, the Swedish battery manufacturer Northvolt completed its construction of its factory in Poland in May 2023. It's the largest factory for energy storage systems in Europe. Poland also has 115 aerospace companies working in what is known as its Aviation Valley, an area in the southeast of the country that has a high number of pilot training centers and industrial and scientific research facilities. About 35,000 people are employed there, among 180 different members that do about 3.5 billion euros in sales, according to the Aviation Valley Association. The association's long-term objective is to make its area one of Europe's leading aerospace regions. Poland's post-communist financial success is all the more remarkable when one considers that its population is declining, despite the huge economic growth. Its fertility rate is only about 1.4 births per woman, well below the 2.1 needed for population replacement. By the end of the century, demographers estimate that Poland will have a population of about 23 million people, only a little more than half what it is today. With this in mind, it is possible that Poland's leaders believe they need to build a top-of-the-line military now, while their country's population and economy is at a high point. Either way, the wealth generated by its economic growth has allowed Poland to increase the quality and quantity of its military. It plans to double the size of its standing army to a total of 300,000 troops by 2035. It is also investing heavily in a modern, technological, and capital-rich military with some of the world's most advanced weapons systems. As part of this process, Poland has deepened ties with the United States and South Korea in particular. First, Poland is creating a modern air fleet based on the 5th-generation F-35 Lightning II fighter jet. Its initial order is for 32 of these planes. Meanwhile, Poland plans to rid itself of older Soviet-era planes like the 4th-generation MiG-29, which it is often keen to donate to Ukraine for the fight against Russia. Supplementing the F-35 is an order of 48 South Korean Fa-50 planes, the first 10 of which were delivered in July 2023. The Fa-50 is a light combat aircraft introduced in 2005. The jet is capable of supersonic flight and performing air-to-air or air-to-ground missions. Just as importantly, the Fa-50 is one of the world's few supersonic training aircraft, making it an ideal choice to train Polish pilots to operate the F-35. 96 American AH-54 Apache attack helicopters are also on the menu for the Poles. Poland is modernizing its tank and armored forces too. It intends to buy 116 American M1A1 Abrams tanks and 250 of the newer M1A2 Abrams tanks. Warsaw plans to supplement this force with 1,000 South Korean K2 main battle tanks. This is in addition to its own force of 1,000 Polish-made Borsuk infantry fighting vehicles. Meanwhile, Poland is steadily donating the Soviet-era T-72 tanks in its arsenal to Ukraine. For the Poles, these old systems are no longer desirable. Poland is modernizing its artillery forces as well. The government in Warsaw is spending $10 billion on the American HIMARS rocket artillery system, which proved so devastating to Russian forces in Ukraine in 2022. It has purchased 18 HIMARS systems as of March 2023, spending $414 million on this platform. And this is just the beginning. Poland plans to buy a total of 500 HIMARS systems from the United States, which will include 45 ATACMS missiles, as part of a $10 billion deal. Considering how much damage only 16 or so HIMARS systems did to Russia in Ukraine in the late summer and autumn offensives in the Kharkiv and Kherson oblasts in 2022, without the long-range ATACMS missiles, this would be a formidable force for the Poles indeed. Supplementing HIMARS are 288 South Korean Chunmoo multiple rocket launch systems. The Poles desire modern tube artillery systems as well. As part of this effort, they are in the process of purchasing South Korean K9A1 self-propelled howitzers. These systems have a range of 34 miles. 600 of these platforms are now in the country. More are likely to come. Poland is also buying about $5 billion worth of Patriot air defense missiles from the United States and is spending $2.4 billion for British CAM air defense missiles. Russian air and drone strikes against Ukrainian cities and civilian infrastructure undoubtedly set off alarm bells among government officials in Warsaw. Poland is creating a modern air defense network to ensure the same does not happen to its cities. Poland's military buildup in size and technological quality is rapidly creating the most formidable fighting force on the European continent. When completed, the 300,000-man standing army will be the largest in Europe by number of boots on the ground. In size, readiness, and technological capability, Poland is set to become the most militarily powerful it's been since its golden age in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth of the 17th century, which the Poles will remember fondly. The Commonwealth routinely defeated Russian forces. In fact, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth defeated Russia in the early 17th century and even occupied Moscow, something that Napoleon and Hitler failed to do, and only accomplished by one other fighting force, the Mongols. For a little while, the Poles and their Russian boyar collaborators installed the son King Sigismund III of Poland as the Russian Tsar. This episode was in many ways the height of the Commonwealth's power, but a century later, the tide would turn completely, and Poland would cease to exist as a state. Poland's new military is a source of pride, a signal that the bad times of partition, occupation, and communism have finally been banished, and Poland is retaking its place among the great powers of Europe. For the Poles, the 21st century military buildup and change in their country's status is not only a matter of pride, it is partially a matter of necessity, and for current, not just historical reasons. Poland shares a border with the heavily fortified and nuclear-armed Russian enclave of Kaliningrad in the north. Russian figures show that about 100,000 troops are stationed in this tight area, but Western experts believe the number might be twice that. Kaliningrad is also home to Russia's Baltic Fleet. Furthermore, Kaliningrad's presence along the borders of Poland and Lithuania creates a rare weakness in NATO's geostrategic position. This weakness is known as the Suwalki Gap, the 40-mile corridor across the Polish-Lithuanian border that separates Kaliningrad with Russia's vassal state, Belarus. A pincer offensive eastward from Kaliningrad and westward from Belarus threatens to cut the three Baltic states, Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia, off from Poland and the rest of NATO by land. Poland would see heavy fighting in such an operation. Meanwhile, Kaliningrad is only about 240 miles north of Warsaw. With such densely concentrated forces in the enclave, a strong military capable of meeting a potential Russian offensive from its westernmost bastion is a matter of national survival. It presents a demand for increased spending that NATO states further to the west simply do not have. In effect, those countries can afford to be the free riders President Obama complained about. Poland does not have that luxury. Its territory is one that would be wrecked if a broader war were to ever break out in Europe again. Germany presents an additional demand on Poland to increase its military readiness. For historical reasons, Poland was uneasy with the comparatively warm relationship Germany shared with Russia prior to the invasion of Ukraine. This situation came partially as a result of the former's heavy dependency on Russian oil and natural gas. The Nord Stream pipeline across the Baltic from Russian to German territory was perhaps the best example of this chummy relationship. Undoubtedly, Germany and Russia's flirtation called to mind the Ribbentrop Pact, the non-aggression agreement between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union in 1939 that partitioned Poland between them, among some policymakers in Warsaw. Poland's military expansion is a way to put pressure on the Germans to pay their fair share of NATO's defense and to remember who their true ally in the 21st century is. For now, the move seems to be paying off, as Germany has declared it will increase its defense spending to the NATO benchmark 2% of GDP in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. There are many skeptics who say they have heard this from Berlin many times before, however. Warsaw probably has a disproportionate amount of them. Poland has also been a leading provider of military aid to Ukraine, with 2.48 billion euros worth. This is far behind countries like the United States, United Kingdom, and Germany, but Poland's aid is the third largest of any individual country in Europe and disproportionate to its GDP. In contrast, the EU institutions have mostly provided financial aid rather than military. Ukraine's defense is a necessity for Poland. The last thing the Poles want is for Russia to get even closer to their border. Russia's aims in Ukraine are antithetical to Poland's very existence. For the United States, Poland's rise to a military great power on the European continent is a most welcome development, to the point that Washington is even willing to lend a hand in the process. In 2022, the United States Congress approved a $288.6 million military financial package to Poland to speed its arms buildup along. The stated purpose was to deter and defend against further Russian aggression in Europe. The aid mutually benefits both countries. For Washington, containing Beijing's ambitions in the Indo-Pacific region is now the #1 foreign policy priority, even with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. With Europe now only a secondary theater in the United States' geopolitical strategy, Poland's military buildup is a much welcome boost for America's goals, as it will reduce the European defense burden, which has been so disproportionately carried by the superpower across the Atlantic since World War II. The American help is welcome for Warsaw too. Poland's military spending comes at a high price tag, about 85 billion euros worth on new weapons by 2030, and with risks to come at the expense of civilian projects. Inflation in Poland is also running high at 17%, and economic growth, though still high, is slowing. There is a risk of resource strain with such high levels of military spending. However, the leadership in Warsaw believes that the price of the arms buildup is affordable and of secondary concern. Jarosław Kaczynski, the chairman of Poland's ruling Law and Justice Party, summed up the mentality behind this expansion in military spending in early 2023 when he said, "It is better to be in debt, and even to have to make cuts to budgets in other areas, than to be occupied. Whoever has seen what is happening in Ukraine should have no doubt about this." Kaczynski, a former Polish prime minister, is considered one of Warsaw's leading power brokers. He was born in 1949 and remembers the bad old days, where he was an active member in anti-communist circles in Poland. He and other politicians of his generation understand what is at stake and what needs to be protected. For them, Poland's ascendancy to a militarily great power is not only a matter of pride, but one of survival. Russia's invasion of Ukraine and its numerous and varied war crimes there stirred both recent and deep historical demons in Warsaw. The response has been to build a first-rate military that will soon be without peer on the European continent, if all goes according to plan. But will it? What do you think? Tell us your opinions on Poland's economic rise and military buildup, and what it means for European and world politics. And don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. This is Poland. Once the tragic crossroad of European empires, it has undergone nothing short of a Western military renaissance in the 21st century and is now becoming one of the most feared armies in Europe. Yep, you heard that right. Poland has become a military beast, and Putin really should think twice before deciding to poke this fully staffed, well-armed, and exceptionally trained bear. The ongoing war in Ukraine has undeniably influenced Poland's military posture. But with the flurry of spending increases, arms deals, and recruitment programs, what exactly is Poland gearing up for, and will it be prepared? After what Poland's been through in recent history, trying to pull off a modern military revival is no joke. Within the span of a single lifetime, the Polish nation waded through shattering, simultaneous military defeats at the hands of both Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, a wartime occupation, partitioning, and tragic Holocaust, and its complete absorption into the Warsaw Pact as a Soviet satellite for the 40 years that followed. Talk about trauma. During the latter Cold War period, Poland's population doubled. It maintained a decently large standing army, often joined by Soviet troops stationed within its territory. The Eastern Bloc country, led by unapologetic communist officials closely aligned with Stalin's regime, nevertheless managed to rebuild its devastated cities in the aftermath of World War II, slowly raising the standard of living among its inhabitants. Over time, hardline Stalinists fell from power, followed closely by many ousted Soviet officers who had for decades filled leadership positions throughout the Polish army. The 1970s and 80s ushered in an era of turbulent protests and political change. The rise of Solidarity, a widely popular anti-communist social movement, preceded mass pushback to and the eventual breakdown of Soviet authority in Poland. The Poles wanted freedom and eventually took it. By 1991, the dissolution of the Soviet Union created the conditions for democratic elections, Poland's first since 1920. This landmark moment was to be Poland's first major step in its inexorable civil-military transformation, one that would see the nation progressively look westward for models upon which it could base its rapidly developing economic, military, and political systems. Poland's Western integration scared the pants off enemy soldiers, and on September 18, 1993, Soviet troops left the country for good. Just 5 years later, in 1999, Poland officially joined NATO. 5 years after that, it joined the EU. But Poland trying to become besties with the West is not a new story. Today, many people forget that though Poland was ravaged by the Axis early on in World War II, its armies in exile fled Soviet gulags and went on to fight gallantly as pilots, sailors, and soldiers within the Allied armies abroad. With hundreds of thousands of Poles voluntarily serving in Italy and on the Eastern Front, they fought with hope that they might someday rebuild Poland from the ashes. A new Poland, one free from the tyranny of coercive foreign regimes. Poland followed this North Star as it cast away the vestiges of Soviet control in the new millennium. Ever since, it has progressively sought to become a self-sufficient, independent power in its own right. Even before it joined the EU, Poland sent 2,000 soldiers to participate in the 2003 invasion of Iraq, then the coalition's fourth largest military contribution behind the United States, the United Kingdom, and Australia. Poland maintained its presence in Iraq for years, participating in and even leading multinational Division Central South, a NATO unit responsible for an entire occupation zone as part of Multinational Force Iraq. Their deployment lasted until 2008, when Polish troops were finally withdrawn from the country, but Iraq was just the beginning. In Afghanistan too, Poland signaled its solidarity with the West. There for the duration of the 20-year forever war, the Poles proved themselves reliable, trustworthy partners, cycling through more than 33,000 personnel in what constituted the largest peacekeeping mission in Poland's military history. We're telling you, you want these guys to be on your side. But don't take our word for it. Western veterans of these two wars whose tours of duty brought them into contact with their Polish allies almost unanimously praised their martial prowess, professionalism, and battlefield capabilities. Each additional year spent as part of NATO's multinational deployments increased Poland's military effectiveness, interoperability, and trustworthiness. With certain pundits labeling Poland an emergent protégé of the United States in Central and Eastern Europe, the nation has more than demonstrated its unity with other NATO allies, as well as its approval and support of American security policies. Since 1989, each successive Polish government has supported America's forward military presence in Europe, seeing in their ally a source of protection, friendship, and economic prosperity it so desperately lacked throughout its fraught history. Poland has repeatedly been one of few NATO countries willing to fulfill their obligations to spend 2% of their GDP on defense spending, a point of friction between the US and its other NATO allies in recent years. With amicable relations deteriorating between Poland's current right-wing government and President Joe Biden, who won the presidency in 2020, Russia's invasion of Ukraine caused a resurgence in Polish-American relations. Ever since, the two countries have reaffirmed their commitment to each other and to their shared desire to arm Ukraine with the weapons it needs to succeed. Great, everyone's getting along. Now let's get down to business and talk about geostrategy and tanks. The latest landmark decision to finally send main battle tanks to Ukraine has renewed attention on the United States and Germany. In reality, Ukraine owes much of the decision's outcome to Poland, who was one of the first countries to pressure a reticent Berlin into increasing its support for Ukraine by asking for approval to transfer its own German-made Leopard 2 tanks. Talk about heart. Jeopardizing its own diplomatic relationship with its German neighbor, Poland acted as a catalyst for consensus, eventually deciding to send its Leopards to Ukraine even without explicit German consent. Arguably, this choice helped bring Berlin and the rest of the West into agreement on the issue. It also demonstrated Poland's proactive leadership role as a vocal opponent of Russian aggression, warnings it has been issuing to Europe since it joined the European Union in 2004. Today, Poland is the security linchpin on the NATO alliance's eastern flank. Strategically placed on Russia's westernmost border, its rapid economic modernization and expansion of its armed forces has catapulted it into 20th place in the list of the world's most powerful militaries. During the war in Ukraine, it has accepted more displaced Ukrainian refugees than any other European nation, several million in fact, providing them access to healthcare, education, and employment in the process. Poland also ranks highly in European military aid to Ukraine, surpassing virtually every European nation save their neighbors in the Baltics. To date, they have sent hundreds of tanks, armored vehicles, and small arms to their imperiled neighbor, likewise opening their roadways to an unending stream of international aid flowing into Ukraine in great numbers. What about the rest of the West? Let's just say Europe's old guard have not emerged from the conflict in Ukraine unscathed. Great Britain is no longer a part of the European Union. Germany's initial reluctance to distance itself from Russian trade deals, pipelines, and natural resources, and the French president's dogged belief in the possibility of a negotiated settlement with Putin despite Ukraine's wishes to restore its original borders have seen each country's prestige fall. Poland has wholeheartedly jumped into this leadership vacuum and is now attempting to warn the wider world about the danger posed by Putin's Russia. In a September 2022 speech, the Polish President Andrzej Duda warned the United States General Assembly that this is not just a regional conflict. Russia's war against Ukraine is a potential source of global conflagration. This war will affect our countries as well as yours if it hasn't already. This, then, is what Poland is truly afraid of. For decades during the Cold War, it nervously awaited a war between the Soviet bloc and the West, knowing its borders might once again become Europe's bloodlands. Today, the threat remains. Eastern Europe is experiencing its worst conflict since World War II, and from the start, global leaders have warned against any actions that could escalate into a potential World War III scenario. Last November, this was almost what happened. That month, an errant missile crossed over into Polish territory, detonating at an agricultural grain-weighing facility, killing 2 people. The event, the war's first strike on territory outside Ukraine, prompted a barrage of coverage. Who fired the missile? From where? Why? Everyone knew NATO's famous Article 5 defense clause in the alliance's founding charter meant an attack on one ally was an attack on them all. Prudently, as the world leaders waited for answers, world leaders, none more patient than Poland, collected and weighed the evidence, ultimately deciding the event was likely a misfire, and ultimately not enough to invoke Article 5. It may not have sparked World War III, but the strike did prompt Polish officials to redouble their efforts to prepare for such an eventuality. Several months before, an opinion poll found that 84% of Poles expressed fears that military action could spill over into Polish territory. Poland, much like Ukraine, knows it could never face Russia alone without the material and moral support from the West. Could it? It would be impossible to predict how a conflict between Poland and Russia might unfold, nor how much support Poland might receive from NATO and the West. One thing's for sure, Poland isn't waiting around to find out. In the meantime, it's doing its utmost to deter Russia by arming and equipping its armed forces in a way that gives them the highest probability of military success. Is it overreacting? We really don't think so. In many respects, Poland now sees Ukraine fulfilling the role it was once destined to fill, the linchpin of European security, the first wall of defense against a Russian bear railing in its unrelenting quest to fulfill its imperialist ambitions. Poland has claimed it will support Ukraine for as long as it takes. The nation's historic antipathy to all things Russian and Russia's blatant disregard for its neighbors' sovereignty has prompted a thorough rededication to its own defense through an impressive military buildup. Poland already arguably possesses Europe's best army, but after the November 2022 missile incident, it looks set to get even stronger. And it means business. Since the start of Russia's invasion, Poland claims it has experienced its highest wave of recruitment since it officially ended conscription back in 2008. In 2022, it recruited more than 13,500 professional soldiers, about 8% of Poland's total armed forces of 164,000. With the recent announcement to astronomically increase its military spending from 2.5 to 4, possibly even 5% of its GDP, it aims to increase its overall force structure to 300,000 professional soldiers. This will not only dwarf Germany's 1.5% of GDP spent on defense, it will see Poland almost double its army of 170,000. It is the type of commitment that shows Poland has already become, in the words of a senior US Army official in Europe, our most important partner in continental Europe. Wait, it gets better. The Polish military renaissance means an even tighter defense alliance with the United States, one of its main weapon suppliers. In 2020, the Polish government reached agreements to purchase HIMARS rocket launchers, F-35 combat aircraft, Patriot air defense systems, MRAPs, and hundreds of M1 Abrams tanks to replace its stockpile of the 240 Soviet tanks it sent to Ukraine. It has announced its intention to eventually incorporate American Black Hawk helicopters made in Poland by Lockheed Martin, other multi-role aircraft, and drones to complement its arsenal of American F-16s already in use among its air forces. This is not all. Poland is also ordering billions of dollars worth of weapons from cheaper South Korean weapons manufacturers, with a $10 to $12 billion order for 180 K2 Black Panther tanks, 200 K9 Thunder howitzers, 48 Fa-50 light attack aircraft, and 218 K2-39 Chunmoo rocket launchers. And that's only the used gear. Poland's appetite for new arms is even bigger, claimed one journalist. Korea will eventually send Poland 1,000 K2 tanks and 600 K9 howitzers in the coming years. It has also purchased Italian Leonardo attack helicopters to be built in Poland. Talk about being prepared for anything. What could go wrong? Well, some do say Poland's unprecedented defense spending will strain its domestic budget to the breaking point, but its neighbors are hardly complaining. They know the more Poland spends, the safer they'll be. Poland is acting on its stated desire to become Central Europe's preeminent military power. Many doubt whether their vision will ever come to fruition. Polish military stocks are still heavily based on Soviet-era surplus after all, but the recent influx of American weapons like the M1A2 Abrams into the country, its diversification to the other foreign weapon markets, and its emphasis on recruiting and training a new generation of dedicated soldiers certainly paint a promising picture that it might. And in the eventuality that Russian aggression spills beyond Ukraine's borders, Europe can be assured that if any country will be ready to fight, Poland will be chief among them. But what do you think? Will Poland eventually find itself in an epic battle with Putin's army? If so, are they ready? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. The war in Ukraine is still raging, and despite Putin's repeated failure to secure enough military manpower with actual training and experience to make any lasting headway on the battlefields, or simply stop embarrassing himself by losing dozens of tanks every week, Russia doesn't seem to be backing off anytime soon. How will the Russo-Ukraine conflict progress? Will it involve Russia's inevitable attack on members of NATO? And if the bear ever decides to strike again, is NATO ready to respond? Let's find out. This is Belgium, famous for its fluffy waffles, artisanal chocolate, and for being home to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, aka NATO. While NATO's headquarters are based in Brussels, the capital of Belgium, its powerful member countries span over continents and include some of the world's most powerful militaries, including the UK, France, Spain, Germany, Turkey, and of course, the US. Impressive, right? But while NATO is composed of as many as 31 member countries with access to combined military forces of approximately 3.6 million active duty personnel, the US military is still one of the largest in the world, with over 1.3 million active duty personnel and more than 800,000 reserve personnel. Let's just say it's a good thing that NATO and the US are in the frat house. Since its very inception in 1949, NATO has reckoned with the possibility of having to fend off a Russian attack. The hows and the whys of that particular scenario were always in flux, but the threat remained the same. Thanks in part to its Ukrainian miscalculation, today Russia, on paper at least, no longer presents the same threat as it once did. According to a very recent report from the Institute for the Study of War, Russian forces in Ukraine are operating in decentralized and largely degraded formations throughout the theater, and the current pattern of deployment suggests that most available units are already online and engaged in either offensive or defensive operations. That leaves virtually no troops left over to attack elsewhere, and that's good news for NATO. But because of its undeniable history of aggressive behavior under the leadership of Vladimir Putin, states underestimate Russia at their own peril. Well, NATO certainly isn't making that mistake. Russia remains its primary geopolitical adversary, and you can be sure it is poised and ready for whatever Russia can throw at it. What exactly does NATO deploy to defend its borders? NATO has had a credible military presence on Europe's eastern flank for nearly a decade now, and since 2022, it has only grown stronger. In the aftermath of the Cold War, the Baltic states eagerly submitted their application for NATO membership, having agreed to undertake the required political and military reforms. On March 29, 2004, the trio of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia successfully joined the world's most powerful military bloc. Since then, these small states, along with Finland, who just this year became the alliance's newest member, have become arguably the most important actors in a hypothetical war against Russia. It is them, after all, who share long, difficult-to-patrol borders with their eastern neighbor, and it is them who will be NATO's first line of defense in a hypothetical war scenario with Russia. Unlike Finland, who immediately brought a robust reserve of 280,000 soldiers, 650 tanks, including 200 German-manufactured Leopards, and what many consider Western Europe's strongest artillery to NATO upon joining, the Baltics had to fight an uphill battle to bring their relatively humble forces up to snuff. When we say humble, here's what we mean. Estonia possesses 1,976 armored fighting vehicles, Latvia has 2,930, and Lithuania has 5,456 armored fighting vehicles, and none of these countries have any tanks. Finland also has a larger active military personnel count compared to Lithuania's 17,000, Latvia's 6,000, and Estonia's 5,000. In short, Finland is pretty hardcore when it comes to military power in Europe, and we're guessing everybody was really glad it decided to join NATO, especially the Baltic countries. As one retired US military officer noted, upon joining the alliance, the Baltic states were at 1 on a 1 to 10 scale of military capabilities. They needed arms, they needed ammunition, they needed vehicles, and they needed training, and they needed it all fast. This, their Western allies agreed to provide them with the aim of making them interoperable with Western-style thinking and doctrine. The Baltic states reciprocated, having proved their loyalty by deploying forces on UN missions and making a not insignificant contribution to NATO operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. You may not realize, for instance, that it was Estonia that agreed to fight alongside Western allies in the Middle East without any national caveats, and for its efforts suffered one of the highest ratios of deaths per capita of any of the Allied countries. Having transformed their political and military systems in a remarkably short period of time, the Baltics emerged as NATO's most critical region. Since the early 2000s, Moscow has repeatedly claimed it was NATO's eastward enlargement that threatened its territorial security and drove it to invade its neighbors. This rhetoric has only intensified as Putin sought justification for his unwarranted invasion of Ukraine, and Finland's accession to NATO succeeded in 2023. Today, NATO's eastern flank is at the center of its strategy to deter and defend itself from a potential Russian attack. This was not always the case. Similar to the way Putin cites NATO's otherwise peaceful enlargement as his rationale for fighting in Ukraine, NATO cited Putin's aggression as its rationale for reinforcing its eastern border. Back in 2014, Russia violated Ukrainian sovereignty by invading and annexing the Crimean Peninsula. This was when the Russo-Ukrainian War truly began. Russia's advance alarmed NATO members, who vowed to strengthen their defenses in response. 2 years later, at the 2016 NATO summit in Warsaw, Poland, the alliance announced its Enhanced Forward Presence, or EFP, operational plan, a tailored forward presence to better deter a Russian attack. Starting in 2017, NATO deployed 4 multinational battle groups to the region, one in Estonia, one in Latvia, one in Lithuania, and one in Poland. Each contains about a battalion's worth of forces, just over 1,000 soldiers, together with their equipment, tanks, tactical armored vehicles, a headquarters company, logistics infrastructure, and everything else they would need to fight. NATO cycles new forces through each battle group on a rotational basis. Collectively, the establishment of these 4 units constituted NATO's biggest regional reinforcement in over a generation. NATO's multinational battle groups are combined arms formations, meaning they employ infantry, armor, artillery, and air power in tandem to achieve their objectives. These unique units are extremely mobile, adaptable, and flexible, trained for an array of threats and combat scenarios. The headquarters for each battle group is integrated, meaning each nation is represented at the command post. Together, they bring unique capabilities to the table in order to bolster collective defense. Each is led by a single lead nation who coordinates the battle group's actions with the host nation, who supplies the majority of their territorial defense forces. The Estonian battle group, for example, is led by the United Kingdom, who furnishes about 800 soldiers, joined by a smaller contingent of Danish, Icelandic, and French soldiers. With its capital of Tallinn just opposite Helsinki, the Estonian battle group oversees the defense of the Gulf of Finland, an incredibly important area that acts as a maritime highway to the city of Putin's birth, St. Petersburg. Further south, the Latvian battle group, led by Canada, which provides about 450 soldiers, is also bolstered by forces from Albania, Czech Republic, Iceland, Italy, Montenegro, Poland, Slovakia, Slovenia, and Spain. As of 2022, Latvia hosts about 1,700 NATO soldiers as part of its enhanced forward presence. In Lithuania, a critical Baltic state that borders the Russian exclave of Kaliningrad, Germany leads the multinational battle group, providing about 450 soldiers, complemented by contingents from Belgium, Norway, Luxembourg, Czech Republic, and the Netherlands. Poland possesses the largest multinational battle group, a rapid response force that would be scrambled forward if any others came under threat. It is led by the United States, who provides 1,000 soldiers on a rotational basis. They are joined by forces from the United Kingdom, Romania, and Croatia. NATO continued developing its enhanced forward presence in the Baltics until 2022, when Russia again forced it to reassess its security commitments in the east. Recognizing the changing security landscape, Ukraine's plight brought additional focus to NATO, who became more unified than ever. After the invasion, NATO members agreed to deploy 4 additional battle groups to the states adjoining Ukraine, a safeguard in case the conflict spilled over into NATO territory. Fortunately, it has not yet, but as of today, NATO has deployed multinational battle groups to Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria, extending its defensive front with Russia from the Black Sea to the Baltic. According to one NATO official, these flexible units are mutually supportive and, most importantly, send a message that we're here, we're ready, and we can respond to any aggression. Colonel Di Bevan, the British commander of NATO Battle Group Estonia, commented that the beauty of NATO's forward presence comes in its unity of effort with many allies and partners, something Russia cannot boast. The fact that we are able to work so effortlessly and seamlessly together and able to integrate, he said, is a clear demonstration of the cohesive nature of the alliance and the unity that we have, and that underscores our collective defense. As part of NATO's forward presence, it is worth mentioning NATO's Baltic Air Policing Mission, a multinational air protection mission that extends over the Baltics in support of NATO's ground efforts. Operating in 4-month rotational cycles, aerial police and interdiction missions are overseen by NATO's Combined Air Operations Center UDEM in Germany, who controls multinational fighter patrols scrambled out of Germany, Lithuania's Šiauliai Air Base, and Estonia's Amari Air Base on Quick Reaction Alerts, or QRAs. Each mission tends to consist of a squad of 4 fighter aircraft supported by between 50 and 100 support personnel. Traditionally, NATO air patrols spend most of their time identifying and shadowing Russian Federal Air Force flight activity, especially around Kaliningrad where it's most dense. According to NATO's website, Russian flights routinely approach or fly near NATO airspace without using transponders, communicating with air traffic control, or having filed a flight plan. Using systems refined since the 1970s, NATO and its subordinate radar sites, control and reporting centers, and combined air operation centers can effectively ensure constant surveillance and control of its airspace 24 hours a day and 365 days a year. Rounding out its joint capabilities in the Baltic, NATO maintains multinational naval task forces in the regions composed of ships from various allied nations outfitted for an array of tasks. But the battle groups are not without their issues. Given the number of casualties sustained by both sides in Ukraine thus far, everyone, including NATO, understands that a single battalion's worth of forces would be far too anemic to actually repel a complex and concerted Russian attack. Multiple Western wargames simulating a Russian assault on the Baltics have reinforced this belief. It was widely believed, dating back to 2017 when the battle groups were first installed, that they would be insufficient to prevent Russia from seizing each Baltic capital within 60 hours or less. A RAND wargame in 2021 revealed how NATO's forward-deployed forces would be rapidly overwhelmed by Russian forces, conducting a well-dispersed, fast-moving advance. That was, however, before they actually tried this in Ukraine, where Russia's true capabilities were laid bare. There are other problems, these more common to coalition and alliance warfare historically. NATO formations speak different languages, eat different rations, operate under different cultural constraints, and employ an assortment of different vehicles and weapons, all of which begs the question, how does NATO maintain its force readiness? Consistent training is key to NATO's military readiness. Regular exercises enable NATO's forward-deployed units to identify and sort out practical problems and barriers to collaboration on the ground. They help each partner understand the techniques and tactics of their allies. In addition, they provide an opportunity to work closely with NATO's air and maritime assets in simulated wargames and scenarios designed to be as realistic as possible. These exercises essentially mimic war with Russia. Each one has 2 teams, a blue team representing the good guys and a red team who represents Op4, or the opposing force. It's the Op4's job to put the blue team through the ringer and make sure NATO allies get a bracingly realistic training experience. Far more than walking targets, Op4 units simulate everything from conventional warfare to hybrid tactics, working day and night to keep the training audience on their toes. This means spending long nights behind enemy lines, gathering intelligence, wreaking havoc, doing everything they can to instill the hard lessons better learned in practice than in the real thing. In air simulations, Allied pilots play the role of Russian aircraft on the attack, testing and probing air defenses on NATO's eastern front and training NATO aircrews for any eventuality. Back when NATO was testing its enhanced forward presence concept, wargames predicted NATO's defeat in a Russian invasion over and over again. It was startling for those paying attention. These wargames opened the alliance's eyes to gaps in its own capabilities and weaknesses it would have to contend with in a war with Russia. In these scenarios, NATO struggled to respond to an invasion of which it only had little to no notice. Likewise, it openly struggled to rapidly surge and transfer troops to the Baltics. While Russian forces only had to traverse some 200 kilometers from their border to get to the Baltic capitals, NATO forces had to travel anywhere between 300 and 600 kilometers, across far more congested territory between the enclave of Kaliningrad and Belarus. The gaps between these regions, known as the Suwalki Gap, was optimal for ambushes with long-range artillery and flank attacks from both sides. The Latvian and Estonian battalions NATO relied on to blunt the initial shock of the simulated invasions were too lightweight, too underpowered to fight off Russia's armored columns. The only armor NATO could scramble in time was light armor in a single Striker battalion. Scrambled from Germany, it simply could not deploy or sustain heavy battle tanks in the field. Published as part of its 2016 report on the wargame, the RAND Corporation labeled its outcome bluntly a disaster for NATO. These fictitious scenarios may have been a blessing in disguise. Fortunately, NATO took note. deciding to build and establish a Very High Readiness Joint Task Force, essentially a do-it-all international reserve force of air, ground, and maritime assets on constant alert to deploy wherever they are needed in a combat situation. NATO also began rotationally deploying US Armored Brigade combat teams in Central and Eastern Europe. On top of this, NATO has a broader response force with heavier follow-on forces it will mobilize in an emergency. At its 2022 summit in Madrid, NATO concentrated on facilitating a rapid Eastern deployment by developing more pre-positioned equipment and weapon stockpiles, more forward-deployed capabilities, including air and defense missile systems, strengthened command and control, and upgraded defense plans. To make this all work, since 2014, the pace of NATO's large-scale military exercises has accelerated. In 2018, NATO held Exercise Trident Juncture to train up its response force, its largest multinational exercise since the Cold War, with 50,000 participating troops. In 2019, 28 different tank crews from 8 different countries descended on Latvia to practice maneuvering, targeting, and shooting exercises on the terrain they would likely have to defend from Russia. In 2020, NATO amplified these exercises further, conducting 88 exercises that ranged in scope from anti-submarine, minesweeping, and anti-surface warfare training to extreme cold weather Arctic training and strategic bombing missions. In 2021 and 2022, NATO conducted one of the world's largest and most complex live cyber defense exercises, along with logistics training deployments, electronic warfare and integrated air defense missions, and nuclear deterrence exercises. To cultivate a sense of urgency, NATO crews must train to switch missions in a flash. For example, naval crews will suddenly go from an anti-submarine mission to passenger transport to the deployment of special forces in the span of a few days. NATO sees the Euro-Atlantic security environment as one in a constant state of flux. These changes show the alliance is adapting to new challenges posed by Russian aggression. If war were to somehow break out between these two sides, NATO would be well equipped to succeed. Its combined military force now exceeds 6 million personnel, well over 4 times that of Russia. The tip of NATO's spear is much sharper, not to mention its vastly more refined support structure, categorically superior in almost every way. According to Statista, NATO also has about 5 times as many aircraft, 4 times as many armored vehicles, and 3 times as many military ships, not to mention the backing of the world's biggest defense spender, the US. Its defense budget alone is well over 10 times that of Russia, who spent a paltry $80 billion on defense last year. The reality, if we're being honest, is that NATO no longer has to worry about such a conventional Russian attack in the same way that it used to, when Russia still possessed its untarnished reputation as the world's second most powerful military. Thanks to Ukraine, that reputation is now in tatters, and NATO's allies and partners have the indomitable courage and fighting zeal of their Ukrainian brethren to thank for that. Today, arguably the best way for NATO to prepare and respond to a Russian hypothetical attack on its own members is, ironically, to keep supporting Ukraine. It not only gains valuable intelligence on their peer adversary, but bolsters its own security in the process. Every Russian tank destroyed in Ukraine, after all, is one less tank that can be used to invade Estonia or Latvia, or any of NATO's eastern members. It is therefore in NATO's interest to continue underwriting Ukraine's war effort. NATO has been clear since the start of Russia's invasion that the alliance would continue to support the Ukrainian military in its fight to restore its sovereign territory as long as Putin's unprovoked invasion continued. This decision, of course, has led it to offer almost everything short of a direct military intervention. Its members have now trained tens of thousands of Ukrainian military personnel, dating back to 2014. It has committed to train tens of thousands more over the coming years as it invites Ukrainians to participate in large-scale exercises using equipment they are in the process of donating to Ukraine. Ukraine benefits by gaining first-hand insight into how these systems are used in concert, something they will undoubtedly aim to capitalize on as they plan and execute their own counter-offensives in the months to come. People who witness these exercises say they feel different since 2022. The training feels more real. Countries who have not traditionally lived up to their defense commitments are now sending more troops to participate than in the past. Now, challenges synchronizing communications between British Challenger and German Leopard tank crews on the battlefield are taken more seriously, as resolving them may ultimately save many Ukrainian lives. Mechanized tactics take time to master, For Western countries, it can take up to 2 years to blend new units into cohesive fighting forces that have gained proficiency in the tactics, theory, and practice of armored warfare. Ultimately, the provision of Western weapons is only as good as the operators who use them. The Ukrainians are up for the task, but they also have an entire Western brain trust in the NATO alliance to help them get up into higher gear. On paper, in a hypothetical war between NATO and Russia, NATO has the edge in the number of tanks, the edge in infantry fighting and armored vehicles, the edge in MRAPs, the edge in self-propelled and field artillery platforms, the edge in fighter, bomber, support and trainer aircraft, the edge in helicopters, the edge in force reserves, the edge in air-to-air refuelers, the edge in UAVs, the edge in airports, bases, naval fleet strength, and submarines. In just about every conceivable domain, NATO has more. Just about the only area of parity is nuclear capacity. Collectively, NATO possesses just over 6,000 nuclear weapons, virtually the same as Russia. Of these, it has deployed somewhere in the region of 2,400, compared to Russia, which has only deployed 1,500 of its own. Russia does have the edge in tactical nuclear weapons, almost 2,000 of them, to NATO's 500. But if you are going to use a tactical nuke on the battlefield, you might as well scale up to the real thing. And nobody, seemingly not even Putin, wants that. Western analysts were once confident Russian ground forces could rapidly seize Baltic territory, overwhelm NATO's frontier defenses, and seize the capitals of Estonia and Latvia in something like 60 hours. Today, estimates for this type of worst-case scenario have come under serious scrutiny, thanks in part to the measures it has taken to build its collective response capabilities, from integrating new members like Finland, to bolstering its enhanced forward presence and rapid response forces, to conducting extensive annual exercises simulating every avenue of conflict. If somehow war were ever to break out between Russia and the West, the result would almost certainly go exactly as you might expect. But what do you think? If Putin does launch an attack on NATO, will he regret it? Is NATO ready to send Russia's conscripts and clanky tanks running for the hills, or could the bear still cause some serious damage to NATO's member countries? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. The United States would absolutely decimate Russia if war broke out between the two nations. That's the opinion of David Petraeus, a former CIA director and 4-star Army general who says that Russia launching a nuke in Ukraine would lead to the US stomping Putin into submission. But there's a caveat to that claim. Petraeus says that the US would lead NATO in a collective takedown of every conventional Russian force, from battlefield equipment to naval, that is stationed in or around Ukraine. What he doesn't say is that if it was a one-on-one fight between Russia and the US, with all of their individual forces focused solely on each other, that America would come out on top. Would it though? That's an interesting question, as the world's two largest superpowers colliding would inevitably lead to a world war that involves almost every ally that either country could muster. But if we could create a hypothetical battlefield in which the two countries fight alone, would the US have what it takes to defeat Russia? Or does Putin have enough tricks up his sleeve to take on America? Let's find out, starting with the most obvious point: the size of each country's military. According to Global Firepower, the US and Russia rank as numbers 1 and 2 respectively in terms of the sheer size of their militaries. Starting with the United States, it has 1.832 million military personnel, 1.39 million of whom are on active duty and not part of volatile paramilitary groups. The vast majority of that military is focused on the ground-based army, which boasts a little over 1 million members spread across active and reserve duty. But the Air Force and US Navy are no slouches, with both having hundreds of thousands of members. The US also has a ton of equipment. A staggering 13,300 aircraft, with 9,975 of those being combat-ready, join 5,500 tanks and over 300,000 vehicles, along with impressive stocks of artillery. On the naval side, the US has 484 assets, including nearly a dozen aircraft carriers and 92 destroyers. It has nuclear-capable submarines too, making its naval fleet a terrifying force, both on the surface and below it. These are amazing numbers, but Russia isn't too far behind. Global Firepower points out that it has 1.33 million military personnel, with 830,900 of those on active duty. That leaves 250,000 as reserves, and a similar number in paramilitary groups such as the infamous Wagner Group. that Moscow essentially controls. In the air, Russia does seem to fall behind substantially. It has 4,182 aircraft, of which global firepower estimates around 2,000 are combat ready, and the Russian Air Space Force, VKS, has a few 100,000 fewer members. Russia also has less military vehicles, 151,000 to America's 300,000, though it comes out on top with tanks, as it has more than double what the US boasts. Its navy is bigger too. Russia has 598 assets that it can call on, though the spread of those assets differs from the United States. It only has one aircraft carrier, for instance, and a comparatively paltry 15 destroyers compared to America's 92. Submarine numbers are about level, though America wins out for nuclear capabilities. But Russia has impressive numbers of corvettes and is likely more capable than the US when it comes to conducting mine warfare. If war were won on pure numbers alone, the US would be the clear victor. It has more of almost everything from personnel to equipment, and even in the naval area, where it lags behind, you could argue that America's focus on more attacking vessels gives it an advantage. But sheer numbers alone don't win wars. Both the US and Russia can tell you that. They have each found it difficult to win wars against much smaller countries, as we saw clearly in Vietnam and are currently seeing in Ukraine. So pure military might isn't the measuring stick for a conflict between the two. We have to dig deeper. Starting with the ground game, both have similar ground force setups. For the US, its infantry squads form the backbone of its armed forces, with its light infantry being divided into air assault, mountain, and airborne units. Each light infantry squad consists of 9 soldiers, divided into a squad leader and a pair of fire teams. Each of those fire teams has a lead, an automatic rifleman, typically carrying M4 carbines and an M249 automatic weapon, a grenadier, and a rifleman. Soldiers may also receive AT-4 anti-tank weapons if the situation calls for it. Mechanize one of those infantry units and you see the addition of both the Stryker and M2 Bradley fighting vehicles. Most interesting here is the new generation of Strykers, which come equipped with either a powerful 30mm cannon or the United States' ace in the hole, the Javelin anti-tank missile. That missile gives the US a mid-range option for taking out tanks that could prove especially useful given Russia's reliance on them as combat vehicles. Russia's equivalent of America's mechanized squads is its motor rifle team, which will typically come equipped with either a BMP-23 or BTR-82A combat vehicle. Those vehicles have 7-man dismount teams, all armed with a pair of PKM machine guns, an AK-74M rifle, and a short-range RPG-16 anti-tank weapon. Those PKMs are starting to get a little dated, though Russia is in the process of switching them out for the updated PKP. However, the motor rifle teams lack a comparable anti-tank weapon to the Javelin, giving the US a slight advantage in that area that would otherwise be more or less equal. However, Russia does come out on top in terms of the sheer number of infantry it can field compared to the United States. Its infantry contains a trio of vehicle platoons, including an extremely mobile airborne unit that enables it to field about 25% more soldiers than the US Army, according to the national interest. Theoretically, that gives Russia more tactical mobility on the ground, especially compared to America's light infantry that is marching on foot. Russia can reach objectives faster and deploy more people when it gets there. But that increased deployment isn't all it's cracked up to be. When Russia loses one of its vehicles, it loses about a third of its combat power that's built into each of its squads. By contrast, the US loses about a quarter because it has so many infantry members already on the ground. Combine that with the Bradley's better armor and superior firepower compared to Russia's BMP, and you have another slight edge for the US. Throw the Javelin into the mix, and the US has more than enough firepower to take on Russia's superior deployment capabilities. Of course, there are caveats on both sides. The first is that neither country's infantry would fight alone. The battle wouldn't be a case of stacking infantry units against one another. Mortars, air support, artillery, and so much more would be added to the mix, meaning that ground-based battles would be determined as much by tactical nous as pure firepower. Terrain is the second caveat, with Russia's effectiveness potentially being curtailed if battles were fought on terrain that favors foot soldiers, given its heavy reliance on vehicles. However, you could also argue that Russia would have the advantage if ground battles were fought in colder climates. And of course, each would have a home field advantage of knowing their territory if the war encroached into their own country. So there are factors at play beyond firepower. though the US likely comes out on top in a ground war. It's better equipped and has more infantry, even if Russia has superior deployment. We see a similar story when the battle takes to the skies. Here, the US has a clear advantage for the simple fact that each country uses its air force differently. Russia tends to focus on small-scale operations with its air force. It typically uses its planes to offer support to its ground troops, with bombing runs tending to be conducted at low altitudes. That approach creates a great risk of planes being shot down by anti-air artillery, as we've seen to great effect in the Ukraine war. According to the RAND Corporation, Moscow has lost between 84 and 130 of its aircraft by August 2023, with the real number likely being higher. In fact, the same group says that Russia may have lost between 27 and 57 aircraft by simply pushing too many of its aging aircraft into longer service. Maintenance is almost as much of an issue as the caliber of its pilots and the approach it takes to aerial battles. By contrast, the United States focuses on composite air operations, or COMEOs. This approach can bring anywhere between 20 and 100 aircraft into a single operation, usually taking place over a large geographical area to achieve an objective. Those craft will vary, with some providing reconnaissance and support, while others attack more directly, creating a multifaceted approach to air-based warfare that allows the US to not only cover large patches of land, but also fend off other aerial forces. Granted, COMEOs often include aircraft from multiple countries working together to achieve a goal, but it's likely that the US would still employ this approach when fighting Russia on its own, especially given the sheer volume of superior equipment that it has. And equipment is another major win for the US. Russia has a large number of Soviet-era aircraft, including its MiG-29s, MiG-31s, and Su-27s. It also uses Su-30s, which were introduced in 1992, making them over 30 years old. Granted, these craft have generally been modernized as much as possible, making them capable of modern air-based warfare, but they're still old aircraft, with a lot of flight miles recorded and relatively few left in the tank. Of course, these aren't the only craft in Russia's lineup, as they also have the more modern MiG-35 and Su-35 fighters to call on, but neither is as advanced as America's best fighters, and Russia's war in Ukraine has shown that it's increasingly reliant on older craft to conduct its air operations. In comparison, the US largely uses the F-16 and A-10 fighter jets, which have been in operation for about 20 years. They're starting to show their age too, though they don't have as many miles on the clock as Russia's older stock of Soviet-era fighters. However, it's in the process of introducing the F-35A Lightning II into its fleet, a fifth-generation fighter jet. The F-35A would likely be the trump card that America could deploy in an air battle that it should already dominate, simply thanks to its superior tactics. So the battle on the ground is fairly even, but the battle in the skies should be in favor of the United States. That was even pointed out in 2020 by a Russian tech billionaire named Mikhail Bolshakov. In an article published on the Russian news website Vzgliad, he pointed out that Russia does have the Su-57, which it claims is superior to anything that America has to offer, but where production of the Su-57 is faltering at best, America already has 500 F-35s, compared to the tiny squadron of more modern fighters that Russia has at its disposal. There's no use in saying that something is better if that something barely exists. For the United States, it could assume that Russia would deploy similar air tactics to those in Ukraine, and those tactics would represent opportunities given the wealth of anti-aircraft options that the US has compared to the soldiers on the ground in Kyiv. The US is looking pretty good so far, but the battle may start to turn in Russia's favor once the Navy comes into play. After all, Global Firepower's figures from earlier show that Russia's Navy is larger than America's. Though the US is no slouch, yes, it has fewer naval assets, but those assets tend toward being more combat-focused than those deployed by the Russians. Still, you can't underestimate Russia's capabilities in this area. Yes, its Navy focuses primarily on smaller patrol boats and corvettes, neither of which present much of a threat to America in a blue water scenario. The deeper you go into the sea, the more America has the advantage simply because of the strength of its destroyers. However, Russia could play a different naval game. While using some of its large ships and submarines to distract America's bigger combat vessels in deep water, it could deploy its smaller vessels to coastal regions. That would be a problem. Corvettes and patrol vehicles are capable of attacking ports and launching smaller attacks, especially once they've drawn in close to a target. They're also more agile than the larger destroyers. meaning they'd present a clear threat to commercial vessels that aren't equipped to fend off attacks from any type of ship. And though the Pacific Ocean would be a huge barrier to these small ships, Russia's proximity to Alaska, its Providenia port is just 250 miles away, could prove a route in. Attack Alaska, establish it as a naval base, and launch from there. Of course, the US would have something to say about this approach. While that proximity is an issue, it would also create a bottleneck if Russia relied on it alone to get its ship closer to the United States. Its smaller vessels would be sitting ducks for America's fleet of destroyers as they cross the Bering Strait. So that would be unlikely to happen. And according to Marine Insight, there's a good reason why. As with its air force, Russia takes a different approach to the United States with its naval forces. Russia is all about strategic deterrence. It uses its navy primarily to keep others away from Russian territory rather than to actively attack in deeper seas. That's not to say it's incapable of blue water combat. It's just not as capable as the US, which would make using its navy to prevent America from landing in Russia via sea a smarter strategy. The United States, by contrast, relies on power projection and is much more likely to deploy its navy into deep waters to combat Russia. It could also use its fleet as launching points for the Air Force's Comeo attacks, get one of its dozen or so aircraft carriers in close, and American fighter pilots could take to the skies to attack Russian ports or even conduct simple reconnaissance. The only area where the two countries are approximately equal is in nuclear-powered submarine capabilities, and it's here that Russia could claw back some ground. According to Newsweek, Putin has been improving Russia's underwater capabilities for years, with the crown jewels of that fleet being the Imperator Alexander III and the Krasnoyarsk. The former is capable of carrying up to 16 of Russia's Bulava intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, giving it the ability to launch heavy attacks from deep waters onto US territory. Putin has been bullish about his subs too, having said in December that he'll be commissioning more nuclear submarines in the future to ensure Russia's security for decades to come. Of course, the US is no slouch in the nuclear submarine department. All four of its main operation classes of subs, the Virginia, Ohio, Los Angeles, and Seawolf, are all nuclear powered. And in the case of the Ohio class, the US has 14 submarines that are capable of launching ICBMs of their own, according to the Nuclear Threat Initiative. So a naval battle between Russia and the US might come down to where that battle takes place. Deep sea battles seem to favor the US, where more coastal conflicts may be the domain of Russia. Still, the US might have a slight advantage here, simply because it has more aircraft carriers, creating the possibility of better cooperation between its navy and air force. But none of that matters if either country runs out of arms. Assuming the battle between the US and Russia becomes a war of attrition, which is likely, barring one potential outcome that we'll get to in a moment, keeping troops stocked up will be essential. Every destroyed vehicle, sunken ship, and destroyed fighter plane will take its toll, with near-constant military production likely being essential, not to mention all the ammunition and small arms that would be needed for ground combat. Right now, the US stands apart in the arms production race, at least in terms of producing weapons for other countries. According to Axiom, the US produced 40% of the world's arms exports between 2018 and 2022, in addition to keeping its own military well stocked. That's leagues ahead of Russia. Though still in second place, it only accounted for 16% of exports during the same period. Of course, the caveat to these figures is that Russia is engaged in a war with Ukraine right now. It's not selling as many weapons because its own forces need them to fight that war, so it's no shock that the US has leaped further ahead. But further is the key term here. Even before the war in Ukraine, the United States sold and produced more weapons. Between 2013 and 17, the US accounted for 33% of all weapons exports, with Russia hitting 22%. Closer for sure, but there was still a considerable gap there. It's an inexact measure of production capacity. And it's not like Russia doesn't have the ability to ramp up when it needs to. As recently as September 2023, Reuters reported that Putin has ordered a cranking up of production to keep Russian troops well equipped, even in the face of increasingly strict sanctions being placed on Moscow. According to Bekan Ozdoev, who is the industrial director of Rostec, which manufactures most of the country's weapons, production of various types of weapons has increased to between 2 and 10 times previous numbers. He also pointed to increased production of tanks, rocket launchers, artillery, and ballistic missiles, all of which should be harder to produce given the sanctions placed on Rostec. Even the United States Treasury recognizes how important Rostec is to Russia,
dubbing it the cornerstone of Russia's defense, industrial, technological, and manufacturing sectors. With Rostec firing on all cylinders, Russia would be able to keep pumping out weapons simply because it's a state-controlled corporation that Moscow ultimately controls. The US doesn't have that luxury. Its weapons come from private companies that are under government contracts. If Russia were to really fire on all cylinders with its weapon production, could the US match it, or would it get wrapped up in bureaucratic red tape and contract negotiations that could delay its weapons production? It's hard to say, but ultimately the production lines won't matter if either country launches the biggest weapons in their arsenal, the nukes. Russia and the US lead the way in nuclear weapons, and it's not even close. According to the Arms Control Association, ACA, Russia has an estimated 5,889 nukes to America's 5,244, giving it a slight edge. Of those nukes, Russia has strategically deployed 1,549 of them, while the United States has 1,410 ready to go. The reality is that Russia having a slight edge in numbers here is ultimately meaningless. Both countries have more than enough nuclear weapons to destroy the other many times over, meaning mutually assured destruction would come to fruition if either was brave or stupid enough to launch. Still, there is an element that might tip the balance in Russia's favor from the nuclear perspective: the RS-28 Sarmat. Dubbed the Satan II by some military experts, the Sarmat missile system entered combat duty in September 2023 and can launch nuclear warheads further than any ICBM of its kind. Its range is somewhere in the 11,000-mile region, with Moscow claiming that each missile can carry 15 warheads. Washington disputes that. It claims the number is closer to 10, but it's the range that's the really worrying part. Russia can launch a nuke from almost anywhere and hit the US. America doesn't have that capability. Its closest equivalent to the Sarmat, the Minuteman III, can travel up to 8,000 miles, according to the National Air and Space Museum. Impressive for sure, and far enough to reach Russia, but the ICBM is outdated compared to the Sarmat. Furthermore, the US Naval Institute reports that America has only tested the Minuteman III's range up to 6,000 miles, meaning 8,000 may be a stretch for the aging ICBM. Even the Minuteman III's intended replacement doesn't outperform the Sarmat when it comes to sheer range. The upcoming LGM-35A Sentinel isn't complete yet, so its specifications aren't public knowledge. However, Air Force Technology estimates that the ICBM is expected to have a range exceeding 5,500 kilometers, which is about 3,400 miles. That's less distance than the Minuteman III and about a third of the range of the Sarmat, which would put the US at a nuclear disadvantage. The caveat here is that exceeding 5,500 kilometers could mean that the Sentinel could go much further. We just don't know yet. The key is that Russia can now fire from land almost anywhere in the world and hit the US with a nuke. Of course, America's air and nuclear submarine options mean it could launch a counterattack at any time, potentially making the point moot. The only thing for sure is that if one country went down the nuclear route, the other wouldn't be far behind. The entire world would suffer the consequences. With nukes in play, the battle between the US and Russia could come down to which is willing to fire first. But if we take nuclear weapons out of the equation, it's clear that the US, by and large, has the advantage. It has more troops, more equipment, and a far more advanced air force that is not only tactically superior, but equipped with better aircraft. On the naval front, the battle is a little more even. Though the US has a stronger attacking force, particularly in deep waters, the smaller boats in the Russian fleet grant it more mobility in coastal areas. And so we come back to the question that kicked off this video. Could the US beat Russia on its own? The answer is probably yes, assuming Russia is fighting on its own as well. Bring Russia's allies into the fray and you may have a whole different story. But what do you think? Does Moscow have tricks up its sleeve that would help it to overcome the sheer firepower that the US has available? Or perhaps there are weaknesses in tactics or equipment that would mean the US isn't quite as strong as it appears to be? Tell us what you think in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts.
Going into war isn't always a choice. More often than not, it's a necessity. And even with NATO's support of Ukrainian independence, it seems like Putin is leaving the US less and less choice in the decision of whether or not to get more actively involved in the war in Ukraine. But if the US had to suddenly engage in a full-scale war against Russia, how would it fare? What plans is it making for such an eventuality? One thing is for sure, Putin had better buckle up. The US military keeps its M1 Abrams oiled up, its Tomahawks loaded, and its star-spangled heroes capes nearby all year round. It is always prepared and has kept a particularly close watch on the former Soviet Union ever since the 1940s. During the Cold War, the West had it easy. Despite communist coups and the proxy wars, the Americans and their NATO allies always knew exactly who the real threat was, the foe pulling the strings behind the scenes, if you will. It was, of course, the Soviet Union. For 45 years, the West had prepared, strategized, and planned for the ultimate eventuality, an all-out military confrontation with the Soviet superpower. Whether the Cold War conflict went hot by spiraling into the nuclear realm, or if kinetic operations remained firmly moored in the familiar bounds of conventional warfare, made little difference. What mattered most was that the enemy and its intentions were clear. Knowing that is half the battle. But what happened next changed everything. The Soviet collapse in the early 1990s kick-started 3 decades of self-discovery as the US spread its wings as the world's sole superpower. Combating terrorists, genocidal dictators, and non-state tyrants became the order of the day. NATO members drifted apart, the alliance's mission and purpose suddenly cast into doubt. Then came a 2-decade forever war in the Middle East. We all know how that turned out. After a decade of strategic revision, the US finally embarked on a wholesale pivot to Asia, now hoping to contain a Chinese threat which had for decades grown stronger, almost in plain sight. And then February 2022 happened. Russia invaded Ukraine. Geopolitical clarity, it seemed, was restored. The aggressive Russian bear, whose foreign policy since the Soviet collapse had vacillated somewhere between bitter Western resentment and surprising Western rapprochement, showed its true colors. America, firmly committed to bolstering its presence in the Indo-Pacific, nevertheless seized the opportunity in Europe. For years it had been nursing its wounds, trying to restore European partnerships and alliances which had slowly atrophied under the pressure of populist politics. The invasion recast these relationships in stone. Everyone in the Western world suddenly saw the reflection of their own histories in Ukraine's existential fight for its independence. The US and its Western allies pledged collective action: sanctions, hybrid warfare, material donations, refugee support, and military training. Everything short of entering the fight themselves. This Western support coalition has shown no signs of weakening now, more than a year into the war. If Finland's recent accession to NATO says anything, it has only grown stronger. What is this all leading to? For the Americans, who for a decade could not drum up the political unity required to deal with Russian revisionism, the Russian threat is credible once more. The pivot to Asia will continue apace. But now, with Eastern European sovereignty under threat once more, America must continue to do everything in its power to prepare it and its European allies for the ultimate eventuality, a full-scale war with Russia. We know you're probably laughing right about now. War with Russia, you're saying. The same Russia that can barely make inroads against a country 28 times smaller and with 100 million fewer people than itself. The same Russia that has allegedly already suffered 250,000 casualties in a single year of fighting, more than the entire number of Russian soldiers killed in every war the Soviet Union and Russia fought since World War II combined. Well, yeah, that Russia. As counterintuitive as it now seems, Russia still poses a grave threat to Eurasian security and Western values the world over. Western analysts are contemplating a number of contingencies that could result from the war in Ukraine, which fortunately for us all has thus far remained contained to a single country. The major one is the potentiality that Russia and its fuming dictator, Vladimir Putin, finally recognizing the futility of winning a long-term victory in Ukraine, go absolutely rogue. Russia has all but burned its remaining capital with the West. Politically, Putin is a global pariah. Economically, Russia has been cut off from Western markets. Its once profitable natural gas left with virtually nowhere to go. Sanctions continue to cut into its ability to supply its military and civilian population. with the specialized industrial and technological parts it needs to function effectively. Militarily, there's little evidence the latest round of mobilization will provide the tactical momentum Russia needs to win over the long term. Rather, it's more likely that untrained Russian conscripts or mobiks will continue to be fed into the meat grinder to little effect. Will Putin back down? You can almost guarantee he won't. He's already raised the stakes too high. His people, his propagandists at least, expect too much of him. He's paranoid. He must deliver on his promises. The Ukrainians, as long as they live and breathe, will never accept the Russian occupation on any scale. As a final recourse, Putin still has his nuclear umbrella, something he knows the West won't gamble on. From our vantage point today, it seems as though Putin's Russia, if it continues its present course, will almost have to go rogue. It won't end the war with a negotiated settlement unless something drastic changes, but as attrition whittles down its once vaunted military power, it will be forced to engage in its antebellum tactics, only far more aggressively. It will rely on asymmetric warfare and hybrid operations to destabilize the West. It will increasingly act like a global version of its now closest remaining ally of consequence, Iran, completely decoupled from the international community, pursuing a revanchist foreign policy using drones, proxy wars, missile strikes, espionage, and more, all while using its nuclear umbrella to deter Western retaliation. Nuclear threats will continue to grow in intensity. Cyber operations will increase in kind. Putin will target vulnerable pipelines and transoceanic fiber optic cables. Russia will continue to fund and sponsor disinformation and misinformation campaigns. Russian bots named Peter and Frank will enter your feeds at election times in the hopes of trolling you into voting for their candidate of choice. The bloodletting in Ukraine will continue. The threat of escalation will remain omnipresent. And that isn't good, because as one think tank put it, a rogue Russia still represents a geopolitical crisis of the highest order. It's a threat to global security, Western political systems, the cybersphere, space, and food security, not to mention every Ukrainian civilian. Let's be clear, Ukraine has blunted, if not outright neutered, Russia's conventional military power over the past year. That feat alone is remarkable. But this war won't end anytime soon. Russia remains a dangerous foe, and elsewhere, especially outside Ukraine, the bear can still bite. Make no mistake. So where, outside Ukraine, could the US see itself fighting Russia, and how would it do so? One of the geopolitical hotspots for a possible confrontation between Russia and the US is in a random chunk of territory wedged between Lithuania and Poland, known as the Kaliningrad exclave. This sparsely populated patch of land is Russia's gateway to the Baltic, a heavily defended former German port city ceded to the Soviets in the aftermath of World War II. Kaliningrad's geography is tricky. The port is literally surrounded by NATO countries. Strategically, it's an A2AD, or anti-access area denial nightmare for NATO, home to thousands of Russian forces, advanced fighter jets, and nuclear-capable Iskander-M missiles. The exclave is connected to Belarus by a narrow 40-mile land bridge known as the Suwalki Gap, which itself cuts into the only two highways and lone railroad connecting Poland to NATO's exposed Baltic states. Since NATO assets cannot traverse the Suwalki Gap without coming under the guns of Russia's military in Kaliningrad, the wide-open rural region is a crucial choke point that Russia would almost certainly exploit if it ever sought to cut off the Baltics from NATO. Finland's accession to NATO has caused tensions in this region to flare once more. In a matter of 1 year, NATO's border with Russia has doubled, adding over 800 miles of densely wooded, difficult-to-patrol tundra. The Baltic Sea has come firmly under NATO's protection, with Kaliningrad the only Russian outpost in an otherwise Western-friendly sea of states. Putin has had grievances against the West for years, and nobody, certainly not now, should bother trying to predict his next move. But prediction and preparation is the express job of America's military strategists. Were Putin to try to secure the Suwalki Gap to Kaliningrad or gain a foothold in Finland, Lithuania, Estonia, or any of its past satellites, the US and its allies must try to discern his regional capabilities and prepare for an open conflict. But what would this look like? How does the Russian way of war differentiate from the American approach? America is fortunate, at least far more fortunate than Russia in this hypothetical. Its robust network of military alliances and partnerships throughout Europe mean it will be far from alone in a war against Russia. Before the war in Ukraine, both Russia and NATO had respected the terms of the 1997 NATO-Russia Founding Act, committing both sides to avoid reinforcing or permanently stationing forces on the territories of the former Warsaw Pact states or their neighboring Russian borders. Russia abrogated itself from these terms when it invaded Ukraine. Now, NATO has a clear pathway to bolster its presence in these critical areas using measured multinational deployments and the increased rotation of permanently based American troops. The fact America's force posture would be complemented by the presence of British, Polish, Italian, Spanish, French, Estonian, Latvian, Lithuanian, Finnish, and many other allied partners speaks to the logic of the American way of war, which in the modern era has become multinational and collaborative to the core. There is strength in numbers and resolve in collective resilience. These force multipliers are not something Russia could count on in a direct confrontation with NATO. In fact, it can only really count on direct, cooperative assistance from Belarus, and amid its attempts to keep out of the Ukraine war, Belarusian loyalty to Russia is an especially unproven commodity. While Russia has struggled to coax Belarus to fight alongside it, NATO's military personnel now exceeds 5.4 million, 4 times that of Russia. According to Statista, NATO also has about 5 times as many aircraft, 4 times as many armored vehicles, and 3 times as many military ships. Not to mention the backing of the world's biggest defense spender, the US itself, with 1.39 million troops alone, and a defense budget of $801 billion in 2021, dwarfing second-place China with a net spend of $293 billion, and Russia, who spent a paltry $65.9 billion that same year. Before Russia invaded Ukraine, each year it conducted massive, multi-day military exercises demonstrating its military power. NATO has done the same, ramping up its collective exercises over the past year in response to Russian aggression. While these exercises show little more than NATO's theoretical military effectiveness, the war in Ukraine has brought Russia into stark relief, and it has certainly been found wanting. Russia is in the midst of a new military reform, something its Ministry of Defense announced at the end of 2022. Most see this as little more than a haphazard attempt to patch a sinking ship. They're trying to grow their modern military to the size it was over 2 decades ago. But today there remains a lack of specialists in charge of maintaining military equipment and vehicles, as well as military infrastructure inherited from the USSR, which no longer exists today. Additionally, there were tens of thousands of auxiliary positions like military financial officers and army construction workers, which have also ceased to exist. In other words, noted Russian military journalist and military analyst Pavel Felgenauer, the nominal size of the armed forces cannot be increased in a realistic and meaningful way. Russia lacks qualified junior officers. There's nobody to command the conscripts they're throwing into battle. The army of 1.5 million soldiers Russia dreams of is little more than a bureaucratic fantasy. Still, Russia is frantically trying to restore its depleted forces to the numbers it boasted prior to the invasion of Ukraine. It isn't working. Its armed forces today are lacking in some areas of modern military technology, including drone capability, electronic components, and radar and satellite reconnaissance, Felgenauer told the media. Yes, we have weapons, but our reconnaissance capabilities are weaker than our attack capabilities. So we have a long-range, sometimes precision-guided weapon, but we don't always know where the target is. But what if Russia went into a full-scale war with the West despite these obvious weaknesses? Let's say for the sake of argument that Putin goes rogue. He sees Finland's NATO membership as the final straw. He still doubts the West will risk starting World War III, and he is desperate for a quick victory in Europe. He throws everything into the Ukrainian cauldron, and it all goes wrong. Armed with Western tanks and eventually aircraft, Ukraine mounts a series of counteroffensives that all but push back Russia to its own borders. Decisively defeated on the battlefield, the enemies of Lukashenko's pro-Russian faction in Belarus stage a coup and oust the leader from power. In the cascading crisis, weathered Belarusian volunteers, which for years had fought in Ukraine, return home and help throw the Russians out of their homeland. Belarus thus switched sides, leaving the Russian garrison at Kaliningrad entirely surrounded by enemy forces. The Suwalki Gap is no longer a concern for the West, but it is for Russia. Over time, Poland, Lithuania, and other NATO countries pressure the Russian garrison to demilitarize. Morale sinks. They are at the whims of NATO naval forces in the Baltic, Swedish missiles on the neighboring island of Gotland, and all but blocked from their homeland. Putin decides the time is ripe to present NATO with a sort of final act. He invades Belarus and, hoping to regain a foothold in Eastern Europe, Putin decides to test NATO's resolve, launching an attack on the Suwalki Gap and small villages along the Estonian, Latvian, and Lithuanian borders. He uses Kaliningrad's Iskander missiles and naval missile corvettes to cover his advance. With the bulk of its reserve forces in Poland and Finland, Putin's forces overwhelm the unprepared NATO multinational garrison in Estonia, which is briefly forced into retreat. Russia immediately begins reinforcing its positions, bracing for the inevitable counterattack as NATO triggers Article 5. NATO's tripwire strategy to place small forward presence battalion-sized deployments in the Baltic to absorb a Russian invasion while it rushed its reserves to the front could not prevent Estonia from coming under Russian control. Latvia looks like it will hold, but only just. But once Estonia fell, all of NATO's Baltic states, supported by its European, American, and Canadian allies, converged. The West has wargamed this scenario over and over again, and Russian units immediately feel pressure from NATO's Response Force and Very High Readiness Joint Task Force, a multinational brigade on a constant state of alert. The initial surge into the Baltics is complicated by Russian missile attacks on roads, bridges, and railways. The US and NATO respond by establishing air superiority over Estonia at high risk to itself, beginning with a massive cyber attack and cruise missile strikes launched by a fleet of B-52s on Russian SAM sites that overwhelm their air defenses. Learning the lessons of the Ukraine war, NATO targets Russia's vulnerable logistics infrastructure, supplying its forward Estonian presence. Superior commercial satellites, drone technology, UAVs, electromagnetic capabilities, and next-generation precision-guided munitions fired by interoperable F-35 fighters enable NATO forces to target railway hubs supplying Putin's war in a way the Ukrainians never could. Once Russia gave up their air to NATO and the US, it was essentially game over. Kaliningrad, isolated and completely surrounded, capitulates in a matter of days. NATO continues to pour manpower and material into Estonia at a rate unmatched by Russia. Its theater assets are better maintained. It has higher morale, reinforced by a clear sense of mission. It suffers fewer casualties, a result of superior airlift capabilities and hospital facilities. It engages in full-spectrum multi-domain operations, or the simultaneous attack from sea, air, land, and cyberspace, unleashing a single symphony of violence to break down advanced defenses. It has been trained for years. Through it all, NATO member countries shoulder a fair share of the burden, thus proving the NATO concept. Russian morale breaks under a withering, round-the-clock assault. The war is over in a matter of weeks. Russian forces beat a hasty retreat to Moscow, and Putin's world comes crashing down as his people, fired up after years of disappointment, global isolation, bloodshed, and military setbacks, finally turn on him. Sure, it's all hypothetical, and yes, it's fair to claim that the West has struggled against forces far weaker than the conventional peers they would face in the Baltics over the past few decades. A fair criticism, but one equally applicable to nearly every country immersed in counterinsurgencies and irregular warfare. It's hard to believe that Russia could ever succeed in an out-and-out military confrontation against the West all on its own. If the West applies the full weight of its collective military capabilities on a clearly defined enemy, the outcome for Putin would be very, very bad indeed. His only recourse, again, would be to threaten the world with nuclear destruction. Would he really go that far? What do you think? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. When you're a big shot at the World Finals of any team sport, gunning for that gold, you definitely want some top-notch players on the bench. You know, those folks who are ready to jump into the game when one of your usual players is either nursing an injury or feeling way too tired. This holds true not only in most competitive team sports, but also on the battlefield. And the two current global powers, the US and China, are very, very aware of this. So what would a potential conflict between China, the United States, and their respective allies actually look like? Which other military powers would both countries utilize to maximize their combat power? And could the recruitment of powerful allies be enough to turn the tides in a potential war? Let's find out. One of the features of a future China-US war would almost certainly be its multilateralism. There are plenty of reasons to assume neither power would go to war on its own. The US has spent 4 generations building a global network of alliances and partnerships which give it crucial regional access, basing opportunities, and deterrence capabilities. Its commitment to ensuring Taiwan could hold out in the event of an amphibious Chinese invasion have been relatively steadfast since the 1950s. As part of its Indo-Pacific strategy, the past few presidential administrations have been strengthening strategic relationships with key players in the Pacific to serve as a crucial counterweight to Chinese influence. These include ironclad treaty alliances with Australia, the Philippines, the Republic of Korea, Japan, and Thailand. Recent events show the US is expanding its network even further, acting on its intention to support a strong India as a partner in its positive regional vision. More on that later. The Chinese haven't been nearly as gung-ho about building effective military alliances as the United States, which could come back to haunt them. Earlier this year, as Australia, the UK, and the US formalized their new trilateral AUKUS partnership to help Australia develop and deploy its own fleet of nuclear-powered submarines, Xi Jinping conducted a summit with Russian President Vladimir Putin in Moscow. Xi claimed the meeting heralded a new era of Sino-Russian cooperation, yet the meeting's accompanying statement only committed the two states to vague cooperative activities like joint production of television programs. There was no formal alliance. There was no overt commitment of Chinese military assistance to Russia's flagging war in Ukraine, and that might be a red flag for the PRC. Some experts have called China's commitment issues an alliance allergy. It's certainly a head-scratcher on its surface. Alliances are notoriously powerful tools for tilting the balance of power away from hegemonic states, something China is clearly trying to do. Yet, China's posturing isn't as atypical as it seems. 4 of the world's most powerful rising powers of the past century, the United States, Japan, Germany, and the Soviet Union, each exhibited similar tendencies. Wary of entrapment, unnecessary financial burdens, and weak regional military partners, China has similarly adhered to its independent and self-reliant foreign policy since World War II. It wanted to control every aspect of its staggering economic and military transformation in the 21st century, even if it meant that its sole remaining alliance partner is the perennially failing state of North Korea. China's confidence in its own military potential and economic growth may not be enough to best the United States and its allies in the Pacific. In 2021, the United States' 6 primary East Asian allies alone managed to collectively spend $149.7 billion in defense, already half of China's $293.3 billion, and 37 times more than North Korea's paltry $4 billion. For comparison, the United States spent $732 billion, and while defense spending doesn't perfectly correlate with military preparedness, it does go a long way. Optimally, the US-led network of Indo-Pacific states would be able to handle themselves in a theoretical war against China. They are a long way from that. A war could hinge not only on numbers of warships, missiles, and aircraft, but on industrial production, cybersecurity, intelligence, geography, technology, and interoperability. In all of these capabilities, Japan, South Korea, Thailand, the Philippines, Australia, and New Zealand lag far behind the Chinese. This year has been touted as the most transformative year in US force posture in the Indo-Pacific region in a generation. The US is the great equalizer in the equation, but there is fear Beijing's robust navy, backed by air power and carrier-killer ballistic missiles, are already sufficient to inflict unacceptable losses on American military forces in a prospective war. Naturally, the next play for the US is to try and create an uncontestable advantage and deterrent, and in the calculation of top American strategists, the best way to do that is to firmly recruit India into its cooperative orbit. And that is where things get a bit stickier. You see, it's easy to make the wrong assumptions about India, especially believing it would seamlessly float into the American orbit and become a trustworthy ally and military partner. Historically, India was a leader of the unaligned movement, a coalition of nations who tried to remain aloof from the bipolar power struggle between the US and the USSR. When, in the 21st century, China ascended to the rarefied air of revisionist great power once held by the USSR, India began to realize it could not afford to remain neutral. Sharing a combustible Himalayan border with the Chinese, India today has charted a pragmatic foreign policy with the West, seeking economic benefits and possible military cooperation as a precautionary measure in the event of a major war. In theory, India has no choice but to hedge against China by aligning with the West. China outclasses its military in virtually every category, including better missile and naval technology, a larger defense budget, more advanced combat platforms, and most vitally, a lot more of them. China might not be producing the cream of the crop in terms of modern weapon systems, but thanks to its robust domestic arms manufacturing capabilities, it can create advanced weapons at a far cheaper cost than if it had to import them. It boasts among the world's best air-to-air missiles, especially the PL-15. India has tried to break even with arms projects of its own, but hasn't had the same success. Just take the creation of the Arjun main battle tank, a platform which entered development in 1985 and was still in development, let me check my calendar, 26 years later. It all seems quite simple then, right? China the angry neighbor, the US the willing partner, India caught in the middle, fielding a perfect opportunity to resolve its security dilemma by establishing a stronger relationship with Washington. In practice, India's pre-existing geopolitical relationships make its budding bromance with the US even murkier. You see, arguably India's greatest geopolitical friendship is the one it enjoys with Russia. Yes, that Russia. India's affinity with Russia dates back to the Cold War, where the two forged close economic and military ties in response to the Indian-Pakistani conflict over control of Kashmir. The Soviets backed India when tensions flared up again in that region in 1971, signing a treaty of peace, friendship, and cooperation that same year. This opened up many avenues of cooperation, especially in areas of defense, oil, nuclear energy, and space exploration. India and Russia's current post-Soviet friendship continues to manifest itself in a variety of ways, including India's extensive reliance on Russian-sold arms, its decision to abstain from condemning Russia's actions in Ukraine, and their participation in BRICS, a multinational body comprised of nations with markedly different perspectives on global affairs, including China and Russia. As of 1991, arms sales from the USSR represented 70% of all Indian Army weapons, 80% of its Air Force systems, and 85% of its Navy platforms. Its first aircraft carrier, the INS Vikramaditya, was Russian-made too. Its Air Force operates more than 410 Soviet and Russian fighters, and its submarine, helicopter, tank, and missile arsenals are predominantly ex-Soviet stock. So yes, considering how messy it would be to curtail access to the Russian spare parts and systems needed to maintain virtually its entire military, convincing India to cut ties with Russia is a tall task for Washington, especially when many Indians today still openly consider the Russians their brothers in arms. The winds of change are blowing, however. While the task of building a viable US-Indian partnership is staggeringly complex, that isn't to say it's impossible. As Russia and China grow closer, Washington has not delayed in courting Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, offering military support packages, political legitimacy, and economic partnerships Putin can no longer promise. Russia's catastrophic military performance in Ukraine has also underpinned the visceral, mechanical, and operational failures of Russia's military systems in every domain. India had already significantly slowed its imports of Russian weapons prior to the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, dipping from 64% in 2018 to 45% of its stock in 2022. India famously even backed out of its joint development of the Su-57 advanced fighter system, as it became apparent that it could not seriously compete with America's fifth-generation fighters. Make no mistake, India has its eyes set on a conflict with China and must prepare accordingly. To compete militarily with the Chinese threat, it will, according to most experts, have to first ditch Russia. It might not have as much time as it needs. India has a respectful level of combat experience, stretching back into its bloody conflicts with Pakistan in the twilight of the 20th century. Yet today, while violence continues between the Indian Army and Pakistan-backed groups along the border regions of West and Northwest India, By far the biggest flashpoint of tension remains along the 2,100-mile-long Himalayan border it shares with China. Skirmishes along what some consider the most dangerous border in the world have been erupting here for decades. Most recently, in December 2022, tensions between Chinese and Indian forces came to a head in the worst fight at what both sides call the Line of Actual Control, or LAC, since 2020. That year, a famous brawl notorious for its fighters' use of a medieval array of rocks, fists, and clubs, some even embedded with nails and wrapped in barbed wire, erupted in the Galwan Valley. As you might have expected, prohibitions on firearms in the LAC did not deter soldiers on either side. The bloody 4-hour brawl claimed the lives of 20 Indian and 4 Chinese soldiers, many of whom died from exposure to the elements, several more having fallen from cliffs into the Galwan River. The episode, and others like it, have inflamed tensions between China and India even further. Their military buildup in the region continues without any signs of stopping, with tensions threatening to spill out into an all-out war. Fortunately for both, geography renders both nations virtually immune to outside invasions. Windy mountain roads and extreme terrain would wreak havoc on critical logistical pipelines. Yet even if India lost territory to Chinese forces along the border, its national security would still be intact. Positioned strategically astride China's trade jugular, India could use naval power to threaten Chinese exports throughout the Indian Ocean and Malacca Strait, through which a vast portion of its energy and economic exports travel. India's lone aircraft carrier would feature prominently in any potential blue water operations against China. It's currently in the process of building another, and it would certainly need both if it hoped to deny China's access to these crucial sea lanes. With over 7 American aircraft carriers patrolling the Pacific at any given moment, and half a dozen more undergoing routine maintenance, naval interdiction would obviously be an area the United States would excel in any future war, assuming India opted to join forces. Taking a page out of China's own book, more recently India has endeavored to build its own new naval base right at the mouth of the Malacca Strait on Grand Nicobar Island. The decision, which was made to secure India's own strategic waterways and confer legitimacy on its position as a regional power, caused an uproar in Beijing. Chinese policymakers likened the Grand Nicobar facility to a guillotine stretching over China's exposed and very long neck, stretching from its southern shores all the way to the Middle East. China knows its trade networks are in grave danger. As the PRC has expanded its global reach vis-à-vis programs like the Belt and Road Initiative, its military strategy has been to build a turtle-style defense shell around the East and South China Seas and Strait of Taiwan. They call this Anti-Access Area Denial, A2AD. The system interlaces overlapping fields of anti-ship, anti-air, anti-ballistic missile systems, submarines, and other naval and aerial capabilities to alter the strategic environment in the Western Pacific, limiting the ability of the United States and its military partners to intervene in regional conflicts. Were India to join the burgeoning US-led Indo-Pacific coalition of states, Washington would have an effective means of countering the Chinese A2AD threat, supporting an allied buildup on the Indian subcontinent, which would further threaten China's ability to conduct trade and military exercises beyond the First Island chain and throughout the Indian Ocean. So if war were to ever break out between the United States and China in the Indo-Pacific, India could be key in tilting the military balance of power. Russia, not so much. As China's major partner, Russia probably presents more of a liability than a boon at this point. Putin's military has demonstrated that it can barely fight a modern combined arms conflict adjacent to its own territory, much less excel or even assist in a conflict with distinct air and naval dimensionality. Most telling of all is the incredible impact that an outsized amount of advanced Western material has had in shaping Ukraine's war against Russia. In 2022, the US deployed several HIMARS batteries to Ukraine to provide long-range and accurate artillery fire. The system transformed Ukraine's tactical fortunes almost overnight, killing generals and top commanders and devastating Russian command posts, logistics nodes, supply zones, and artillery batteries. Western arms and intelligence primed Ukraine's fall 2022 counteroffensive and prevented further territorial losses when Russia bloodlet itself in its savage human wave attacks on Bakhmut over the previous winter. For comparison, the US has over 400 HIMARS batteries of its own, an order of magnitude greater than those utilized by Ukraine of late. If anything, Russia has proven to the world that the operations it can most admirably conduct are digging in, throwing poorly trained, ill-equipped conscripts into the trenches, and praying their Soviet vintage minefields hold true. That is, if it has months to prepare. It's not yet clear whether this tactic will have any discernible impact in a major war involving China. But with North Korea the only other true suitor, China is scraping the bottom of the barrel in terms of reputable allies. The truth of the matter is that Russia's air and naval assets are crumbling, the two things which could impact the outcome of a potential conflict against a US-Indian alliance. Russia's air force has barely registered its presence in the war against Ukraine, with Putin only committing a portion of his available assets to that fight. We now have a better idea of why. Russia is struggling to recruit and train qualified pilots. While systems maintenance have deteriorated, a leaked memo revealed that Russia has had to send many training instructors into the war zone, compounding the kink in its training pipeline when they did not come back. Russian pilots are reported to only receive somewhere in the ballpark of 70 to 120 flight hours a year. If they're lucky, their pilots receive a maximum of 200 hours of flight training before joining a combat-ready squadron. In comparison, American pilots receive even more hours than this on a training simulator before even climbing into the cockpit of a fighter jet. Their first 25 hours of true flight training come in propeller-driven aircraft. The next phase is a specialized undergraduate training program, coupling classroom instruction with 90 hours of additional flights in other propeller-driven aircraft. Then 115 hours later, they are assigned to the aircraft they'll fly in active service. Fighter and bomber pilots fly 100+ hours in a jet trainer aircraft for their next phase of training. By then, they've accumulated more hours than their Russian counterparts will by the time they've reached the battlefield. These American pilots won't be combat ready until they've completed another 20-hour intro to fighter fundamentals course. That, of course, is before they spend another year in their dedicated airframe. By the time they join their combat-ready squadron, they've got as many flight hours as a war-weary Russian combat veteran. The pilot crisis is just one dimension of the cracks in Russia's military effectiveness. It struggles to conduct the most basic of joint operations. If they allied with China, cooperations become even more difficult. Sure, the US would have to deal with the language barrier with most of its East Asian allies, yet it has a proven track record of long-term cooperation in multinational military settings, staging large-scale joint combined military exercises with a diverse array of partners across the globe to simulate harsh wartime conditions. The US too boasts decades of experience building resilient alliance systems like NATO, whose integrated command functions and daily practices promote interoperability on every level. These strengths wouldn't easily transfer over to the Indo-Pacific battlespace, but any starting point is better than no starting point. As a parting example of the importance of familiarity and trust in one's partners as the bedrock of joint and combined operations, take the United States' role in Operation Desert Storm. In that conflict, the United States managed to clear Iraqi airspace of all threats, suffering only a handful of casualties and friendly fire incidents in the process. This was an impressive feat, considering the fact that the coalition was fielding over 4,000 aircraft at the time. By comparison, Russia has been trying to field a few hundred platforms in airspace half the size, landing almost as many kills on its own airframes as Ukraine has. Just last month, Russia shot down its own Su-35 jet for a second time within a matter of days. According to a sarcastic Russian military blogger, at this rate of work from our valiant air defense, we'll soon be left without aviation. Add to this recent intelligence leaks indicating that Russia has resorted to the time-tested tactic of executing conscripts who refuse to follow orders, and threatening to execute entire units if they seek to retreat from Ukrainian artillery fire. And you have a recipe for disaster, especially if they ever hope to cohere with Chinese air and ground forces. Assuming a theoretical conflict remained conventional, China would have to do the most of the heavy lifting. It didn't have to be this way. Russia has done the entire Western world a favor playing its hand in Ukraine, revealing that it can contribute little in terms of military support in its tentative military partnership with the PRC. For now, the jury is still out on India. If it had the United States and its 50 allies and partners clearing the skies and seas over the Pacific, who, by the way, spend a third of the world's entire annual defense budget, it could play a notable role offering a credible threat to Chinese trade. Indian ships could bolster American expeditionary logistical capabilities, offer medical facilities, and serve as a jumping-off point for the containment of the PRC between the Straits of Malacca and the Gulf of Oman. In the end, a US-Indian alliance is simply too powerful for a Sino-Russian alliance to overcome. This growing partnership could ensure that China's ambitions to dominate Asia and upset the liberal world order remain nothing but a pipe dream. But what are your thoughts on this? In a face-off between China and the US and their respective allies, who would win and why? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. The US would come to Taiwan's aid if China attacked. That's the most common scenario for the wargame simulation. For the last decades, China has been rising and making it clear that Taiwan should undoubtedly be its territory. At the same time, it is seductive to ask, could the US conquer China on its own? More and more governments are looking to war as an effective way to resolve long-standing conflicts, and tensions between the US and China are rising from time to time. Let's start with analyzing the nuclear arsenal. In accordance with the March 2023 New START Declaration, the United States possesses 1,419 strategic nuclear warheads that are distributed across 662 strategic delivery systems, including intercontinental ballistic missiles, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and heavy bombers. In accordance with the New START Treaty, the United States and the Russian Federation are required to conduct semi-annual exchanges of information regarding treaty-accountable items. Additionally, the United States maintains an approximate inventory of 100 B-61 nuclear gravity bombs, which are forward deployed at 6 NATO bases located in 5 European countries. These bases include Aviano and Gedi in Italy, Buchel in Germany, Incirlik in Turkey, Kleine-Brogel in Belgium, and Volkel in the Netherlands. On October 5, 2021, the US State Department released a declassification announcement revealing that the total count of both active and inactive US warheads stood at 3,750 as of September 2020. It's worth noting that these figures exclude retired warheads and those awaiting dismantlement. According to the Federation of American Scientists, FAS, the current military stockpile is estimated to consist of 3,708 warheads, with an additional 1,536 retired warheads awaiting dismantlement. Consequently, the total number of warheads as of early 2023 is estimated to be 5,244. Big number, right? Actually, this figure signifies a huge decrease in the stockpile compared to its peak of 31,255 at the conclusion of the 1967 fiscal year. What about the Chinese nuclear arsenal? Managing the count of nuclear warheads in China poses greater challenges. Over the past few decades, China has consistently modernized its nuclear capabilities, with a significant expansion in both the number and variety of weapons deployed in recent years. As of November 2022, the Defense Department's assessment suggests that China might possess as many as 1,000 deployable nuclear warheads by the year 2030. According to independent researchers, China could now have approximately 410 operational warheads ready for deployment across 218 strategic delivery systems, including intercontinental ballistic missiles, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and nuclear-capable bombers. China is currently in the process of constructing a new generation of submarines equipped for carrying nuclear warheads, with the utilization of Russian technology playing a significant role in their development. The incorporation of Russian technology is expected to enhance the submarine's stealth capabilities, making them considerably more challenging to detect and track. A study conducted by the China Institute of Maritime Studies at the US Naval War College has underscored the potentially profound implications of these upgraded Chinese submarines for the United States and its allies in the Indian Ocean. Analysts and defense experts suggest that the creation of these advanced Type 096 nuclear submarines may be finalized by the end of this decade. Christopher Carlson, a naval intelligence analyst, has described the new 096 submarines as a nightmare due to their anticipated extreme difficulty in detection. So what would a nuclear war between these two countries look like? Forecasting the scenarios of a nuclear war between the US and China shows that in the absence of the decisive influence of other factors, there would be no winners in such a battle. The exchange of even a dozen nuclear strikes would have a huge impact on international security and the ecology of the affected territories. Hundreds of thousands of people would die. The fact that nuclear weapons are used would lead to increased escalation and retaliation, and the spiral of violence and death will only grow. The use of hundreds of warheads would cause the destruction of the foundations of the existence of the modern world, its economy and nature. If the US and China decide to use all their nuclear warheads, the result would be sub-zero temperatures within a few years, and most of the planet's population would die of starvation or disease. That is why most experts avoid the prospect of using nuclear weapons during such a conflict. At the same time, there are opinions that China may be able to use it if it feels it poses a significant threat to its own security. During war, the leaders do not always think rationally. In general, the USA has the second largest nuclear arsenal in the world, and China has the third, but the usage would be a loss for both sides. Okay, the mutual destruction by nuclear weapons is obvious, but who is stronger in other types of armed forces? Let's begin with the Air Force. The modern air power of the United States Armed Forces stands unrivaled, boasting a formidable fleet of over 13,000 aircraft across various categories, with over 5,000 of those just in the Air Force. China can only dream about such a number. This comprehensive inventory encompasses combat and direct attack aircraft, alongside a substantial complement of transport planes, aerial refuelers, specialized mission platforms, and training aircraft, including both fixed-wing and rotary-wing models. Through ongoing modernization efforts, select Cold War-era aircraft have been effectively adapted for contemporary battlefield demands. Additionally, the US Air Force has made significant strides in its commitment to next-generation platforms like the F-22 and the F-35. The US Air Force remains unique in its possession of a dedicated bomber fleet capable of conducting conventional and nuclear missions. Furthermore, its Special Mission Force excels in various specialized airborne operations, offering invaluable support to Allied aircraft and ground commanders. The US Navy maintains an expansive carrier force, enabling it to project power and engage adversaries worldwide effectively. Yes, US troops are everywhere in the world. The US Marine Corps boasts an impressive array of aircraft, rivaling and often surpassing the capabilities of top-tier international air services. US Army aviation is anchored by a vast rotorcraft fleet, featuring the AH-64 Apache attack helicopter and the UH-60 Black Hawk as prominent examples. A breakdown of the US Air Force's composition reveals that nearly 25% are combat direct attack aircraft, close to 40% are rotorcraft helicopters, 7.4% constitute the transport fleet, 18.4% are dedicated to training, and 9.4% serve in special missions and other roles. The most popular models are Boeing AH-64 Apaches 808, Lockheed F-16 Fighting Falcons 775, Sikorsky SH-60 Seahawks 508, Northrop T-38 Talon 497, Raytheon T-6 Texan IIs 445, Boeing CH-47 Chinook 394, Boeing KC-135 Stratotanker 388, Airbus UH-72 Lakota 367, Lockheed F-35 Lightning II 310. Discussing the future strategy of the United States Air Force is a crucial and high-stakes topic. The 2022 National Defense Strategy underscores the importance of deterrence through denial, urging the Department of Defense to explore asymmetric approaches and enhance its posture of denial to discourage potential aggression, particularly in scenarios where adversaries might attempt swift territorial acquisition. The debate at hand within the broader discussion centers on how to implement this approach, with two prevailing schools of thought. The first school of thought emphasizes the significance of air superiority and the capability to overcome China's air force as vital elements in achieving effective deterrence. The second line of thought advocates a defensive strategy. Let's take a look at the Chinese Air Force next and see how they compare to the US. Upon closer examination, Chinese air power reveals a predominant reliance on a copy-and-paste approach for many of its frontline combat assets, comprising a total of 3,044 units, or only a little over half of the US Air Force's 5,000 aircraft. These Chinese entries predominantly originate from Soviet, Russian, French, Israeli, or American sources, with few genuinely domestically developed products to highlight. Although their overall quality and battlefield effectiveness remain largely unproven, the Chinese military can boast significant quantities to deploy in the event of a full-scale conflict. The foundation of modern Chinese air power is primarily attributed to contributions from the former Soviet Union, modern Russia, and more recently, France. A breakdown of the Chinese Air Force's composition reveals that 47.5% are combat direct attack aircraft, almost 40% are rotorcraft helicopters, 8.8% constitute the transport fleet, 12.3% are dedicated to training, and 3.4% serve in special missions and other roles. The most popular models are Chengdu J7 Fishcan 387, Shenyang J11 Flanker L 315, Milhai 17 HIP 242, Chengdu J10 Firebird 235, Harbin Z9 175, Hongdu JL8 170, Zhan H6 120, Chang Z10 106. As you can see, it's not so impressive compared to the US. Does this mean the US would ultimately beat China in an aerial battle? In the event of a conflict, the foremost objective of the US Air Force would be to wrest air superiority from China. Simultaneously, it is essential to weaken Chinese forces by employing precision strikes from a considerable distance. When the pivotal moment arises, the Air Force can execute a sudden, forceful shift to offensive air superiority, akin to wielding a swift and decisive retribution. To attain air superiority, American forces will need to target China's robust, integrated air defense systems, including critical assets within the mainland, such as air bases, radar installations, air defense assets, and potentially command and control centers. Conversely, China's primary aim is to maintain control over its airspace. Their strategy centers on denying access to their airspace to limit the US's capacity to achieve and utilize air superiority for offensive military operations. This approach allows for resource preservation by employing a substantial quantity of smaller, cost-effective weapons distributed across various locations. The defender of airspace aims to endure the initial air and missile strikes from the adversary and subsequently contest control over the airspace. Conversely, the attacker seeking air superiority against modern air defense systems must overcome multiple layers of defense across various ranges and altitudes. The advantage clearly lies with the defending side. Attempting to breach heavily fortified Chinese airspace would likely result in significant losses. If a US endeavor to secure air superiority and swiftly defeat Chinese invasion forces proves unsuccessful, it could lead to a catastrophic defeat that jeopardizes the Air Force's ability to sustain a defensive war of attrition. These factors collectively erode deterrence. China deploys a mix of Russian-manufactured and domestically produced air defense systems, with the capability to track and engage enemy aircraft. The technological sophistication of these weapons, coupled with their potential for upgrades, presents significant challenges for the United States in its quest for air superiority in a large-scale engagement. China's air defense arsenal includes the formidable Russian-built S-300 and S-400 surface-to-air missile systems, renowned for their effectiveness worldwide. These systems can undergo upgrades to enhance their capabilities further. The latest iterations of the S-400 and upcoming Russian S-500 missiles are interconnected thanks to high-speed computer processing that enables precise, long-range threat detection. These systems offer extended range and heightened sensitivity compared to their predecessors. However, it's important to note that the ability to detect the presence of an aircraft in the sky doesn't guarantee continuous tracking or successful engagement of the aircraft. China's air defense threat extends beyond Russia's built systems, as the People's Liberation Army Air Force complements them with domestically developed systems. China operates its indigenous HQ-9 surface-to-air missiles and is actively working on the HQ-19 missile systems, designed to counter ballistic missile warheads. As a result, any potential aerial assault over mainland China would likely require aircraft to operate at higher altitudes to avoid detection by air defense. Alternatively, unmanned systems could be employed for target reconnaissance, or long-range ballistic and cruise missiles fired from land or sea platforms could be utilized to neutralize Chinese air defenses from safer standoff distances, minimizing the exposure of manned aircraft to enemy fire. So the US is unlikely to be able to achieve control over the air by conventional means due to China's advanced air defense system. It would just be too expensive. The losses would be huge, and it's not a fact that the USA would be ready to take them. Upon scrutinizing the Russian-Ukraine conflict, military experts from various nations recognize the escalating significance of drones in future warfare. The United States is progressively incorporating more drones into its strategic planning. The objective is to compel China to expend costly missiles to eliminate a plethora of inexpensive and readily available UAVs. Drones are poised to enhance reconnaissance capabilities, neutralize air defense systems, target naval vessels, and deplete enemy resources more effectively. Concurrently, China is actively advancing its drone programs and scaling up production efforts. In alignment with this trend, a new strategy within the US Air Force proposes a pivotal role for drones, operating in coordination with fighter aircraft. The US Space Force envisions drones not as independent combat units but as integral components of the Air Force's Collaborative Combat Aircraft initiative. In this concept, a manned fighter is accompanied by an AI-equipped and armed drone, designed to be cost-effective and capable of autonomous and paired operations. The outcome of a potential drone confrontation between the United States and China remains uncertain, but these unmanned systems possess the potential to yield significant advantages and disadvantages for both sides. And what about the trial weapon? Army ground forces. US ground forces are undergoing a comprehensive modernization effort to align with the demands of contemporary warfare, moving away from Cold War-era doctrines toward a more agile and mobile fighting force. The US Army's composition comprises 416,504 units, categorized into various types: 361,127 utility and engineering vehicles, 44,124 infantry fighting vehicles, 4,657 combat tanks, 3,000 air defense units, 2,322 artillery SP, and 1,267 artillery towed. At the forefront of advancing ground forces is the M1 Abrams main battle tank, MBT, renowned as one of the heaviest modern tanks. Weighing between 57 and 61 tons, the Abrams is equipped with multi-layer composite armor, which incorporates depleted uranium for its high-density properties and operates on gas turbine engines running on jet fuel. Because of this, of course, the speed of the vehicle suffers, a little more than 41 miles per hour. This American tank has been in service with the US Army since 1980. The latest iteration, the M1A2 SEP variant, features advanced computerization, thermal imaging, and GPS systems for remote weapon control. The Abrams tank has played pivotal roles in conflicts such as Operation Desert Storm, Enduring Freedom, and Iraqi Freedom. Multiple Abrams tank modifications exist to meet diverse operational needs. Additionally, the M2 Bradley Infantry Fighting Vehicle, IFV, is a staple in the US military's inventory. This American-tracked IFV, produced by BAE Systems Land and Armaments, features a conventional IFV layout, with the engine transmission compartment at the front and the infantry compartment in the rear hull. Its crew comprises a commander, gunner, and mechanic driver, and the BMP is capable of carrying up to 7 paratroopers. The M2 Bradley boasts an aluminium body and laminated armor, providing protection against 0.57-inch caliber bullets. It is armed with a 0.98-inch M242 automatic cannon and 2 BGM-71 TOW launchers, which demonstrated its prowess in countering Soviet tanks during the Persian Gulf War. An essential addition to the US military is the Stryker, which has expanded its presence due to its versatility across a range of battlefield roles. General Dynamics Land Systems manufactures the Stryker armored combat vehicle, which has been in service since 2002. With 350 horsepower, the Stryker achieves a range of 329 miles and a speed of 38.5 miles an hour. It can accommodate 2 crew members and 9 passengers, with the driver being able to switch between 8x4 on-road and 8x8 off-road modes. Various weapon systems can be mounted on the Stryker, such as the 12.7 M2 Browning machine gun or the Mark 19 grenade launcher. Moreover, the Stryker is equipped with a V-shaped bottom and Mexus modular composite armor capable of withstanding 12.7 caliber bullets. The US military is also incorporating an expanding fleet of wheeled vehicles, drawing from experiences in urban warfare in Afghanistan and Iraq. As we can see, the US has significant forces. But what about China? In the historical context, the Chinese land forces have traditionally relied on the Soviet Union and later Russia as their primary sources for military hardware, with recent diversification including Western support, notably from France. An increasingly noteworthy trend is the development of indigenous Chinese solutions to meet local requirements across a spectrum of categories, including main battle tanks, armored fighting vehicles, artillery systems, multiple rocket launchers, and security vehicles. In total, the Chinese land forces maintain and operate a substantial fleet of nearly 200,000 armored and unarmored vehicles, alongside a considerable artillery force, solidifying their position among the world's top 4 land forces. This inventory encompasses 121,300 utility and engineering vehicles, 17,020 armored fighting vehicles, 5,015 combat tanks, and 4,591 artillery pieces. The Type 96, initially designed as the Type 88C, represents a key component of the People's Liberation Army's tank forces and was a main battle tank introduced into service in 1997. Its development commenced shortly after the conclusion of the Gulf War in 1991. The Type 96 marked a milestone as the first Chinese tank equipped with a 4.92 inches smoothbore gun and automatic loader. The tank features a forced liquid-cooled diesel engine generating 1,000 horsepower, facilitating a maximum speed of 40 miles per hour. Its main gun is an unlicensed copy of the Russian 2A46M, boasting a barrel length of 48 calibers. The ammunition capacity stands at 42 rounds, with 22 of these stored in an automatic loader mechanism akin to the T-72 design. The PLA ground force is extensively mechanized, equipped with a variety of armored platforms, advanced electronic warfare capabilities, concentrated firepower, and modern weapon systems that hold their own against their Western counterparts. But machines of war are nothing without people. So let's talk about the manpower of armies next. The United States has a population of 337,341,954, with a manpower pool of 148,430,460 individuals. The total number of military personnel is 1,832,000, comprising 1,390,000 in active military service and 442,000 in reserve. The US military enforces a stringent selection process for candidates. Despite its rigor, it serves as the largest employer, providing soldiers with competitive salaries and comprehensive benefits. Eligible Americans can begin their military service at the age of 17, with an age limit of 42. Upon successful testing and evaluation, candidates sign contracts ranging from 2 to 6 years. Strict physical fitness requirements, assessed through the Army Physical Fitness Test (APFT), are pivotal during the candidate selection process. This test includes 35 push-ups, 50 abdominal exercises in 2 minutes, and a 2-mile (3.2 kilometers) cross-country run within 16.5 minutes. This test is mandatory not only for recruits but also for active military personnel, who must take the APFT every 2 years. The standards may slightly vary with age, and individuals in excellent physical condition are subject to specific criteria, which are outlined in a separate document. For instance, a man with a height of 5.58 feet should not exceed a maximum weight of 180 pounds, and for women of the same height, the limit is 161 pounds. Moreover, all candidates must undergo a mandatory background check to ensure a clean legal history, maintain a strong credit record, and have no visible tattoos. China, with its vast population of 1 billion people, boasts one of the world's largest standing armies, totaling around 3.1 million personnel across standard service branches, Army, Navy, and Air Force. This includes over 2 million active personnel, constituting over 60% of the available manpower. In the event of conflict, China's substantial population provides a deep pool of potential recruits, enabling a strategy of attrition warfare through sheer numerical strength. The Chinese military utilizes a range of small arms such as pistols, submachine guns, rifles, sniper rifles, machine guns, and mortars, in addition to portable battlefield solutions, including anti-aircraft and anti-tank missile systems. The People's Liberation Army sets specific requirements for aspiring recruits. Chinese military leaders emphasize the importance of maintaining an image of the most experienced and disciplined armed forces. Obese military personnel may face limitations on career progression, motivating constant physical improvement. The Chinese military promotes physical fitness through numerous competitions among its ranks. An intriguing restriction introduced in 2006 bans individuals who snore consistently from joining China's military academies, as it's believed that such snoring can disrupt the daily activities of other cadets and hinder their military training. Clearly, these vast armies are not simply transported and deployed on land without careful planning. Aviation and the Navy play a crucial role in facilitating the arrival and landing of tens of thousands of troops and equipment. Therefore, let's examine the critical component for such operations, the naval fleets. The US Navy's carrier fleet sets it apart significantly from its regional rivals. At the forefront are 10 nuclear-powered carriers from the Nimitz class, which, while rooted in Cold War concepts and technologies, have led the service to invest heavily in the new Gerald R. Ford class, promising to enhance US naval capabilities. Currently, only one of these supercarriers is in active service. Additionally, the carrier force is supplemented by straight-deck amphibious assault ships, primarily designed for rotorcraft operations, but also capable of supporting fixed-wing strike aircraft like the AV-8B and advanced F-35 VTOL aircraft. The attack submarine fleet consists of all-nuclear submarines, including remnants of the Cold War era like the Los Angeles, Ohio, and Seawolf classes, as well as the more modern Virginia-class boats, which are gradually replacing the older Los Angeles vessels. The guided missile cruiser fleet, also a product of the Cold War period, is slated for reinvestment with the introduction of a modern frigate design, as the current destroyer-heavy fleet lacks such vessels. The US Navy maintains a functional mine and countermine force, patrol vessels, and the historic three-masted USS Constitution, the oldest active ship afloat. The Navy also operates various support ships that streamline a wide range of naval operations. So how does China fare in this category? The People's Liberation Army Navy, PLAN, has made significant advancements over the past few decades, enhancing its surface and undersea vessel capabilities and bolstering support ships. Now it's as close to US capabilities as ever before. An essential component of its power projection strategy, both regionally and globally, is the growing strength of its fixed-wing carrier fleet, currently consisting of 2 carriers. This force will soon be augmented by 2 indigenous designs, offering improved capabilities for blue water environments. The submarine fleet, which includes over 70 boats from multiple classes, still has some life left in it, with only a few beginning to show signs of aging. The destroyer fleet is relatively young, with some of the oldest units not yet reaching 30 years in service. Similarly, the frigate fleet is youthful, with a few exceptions, and currently includes only 40 vessels. The PLAN places a particular emphasis on its corvette strength, boasting around 70 modern vessels in this category. The mine-countermine fleet, consisting of 8 units, is relatively old, with the youngest being 27. The offshore strength hulls are also approaching a critical stage in their service lives, with the 10 vessels being over 25 years old. The amphibious assault force has seen a revival with the introduction of modern players designed for helicopters and transport operations from ship to shore. Additionally, 24 vessels are on order, strengthening the fleet in the carrier, submarine, destroyer, and landing helicopter dock categories. Overall, the PLAN has made significant progress in enhancing its naval capabilities. Its ultimate goal is to one day challenge the United States as the world's preeminent naval power. So which navy would win? At present, the United States regards the Chinese Navy as a formidable force, capable of contesting American naval dominance in the Western Pacific Ocean during a military conflict. This marks the primary strategic challenge for the US military since the end of the Cold War. It's worth noting that this is a pivotal moment in the contemporary era of global geopolitical competition. Throughout history, naval arms races and fleet rivalries have consistently foreshadowed shifts in global leadership. The competition between the United States and China in military capabilities, particularly with their respective navies, is just one facet of the broader strategic rivalry encompassing political, diplomatic, economic, technological, and ideological dimensions. The US sees the Chinese Navy as a critical component of China's efforts to challenge the United States, the primary military power in the Pacific. Over the past 25 years, China has been actively modernizing and expanding its naval capabilities. US observers have expressed concerns and, in some cases, raised alarms about the pace of growth and development in Chinese naval shipbuilding. They scrutinize the evolving capabilities of the Chinese Navy in comparison to the US Navy and conclude that the United States is gradually losing its edge. China's naval modernization encompasses a broad spectrum of initiatives, including the introduction of new ships, aircraft and weapons, enhancement in maintenance and logistics, the development of naval doctrine, improvements in fleet personnel quality, education and training of naval personnel, and extensive exercises. American experts have identified certain areas of weakness within the Chinese Navy, including limited compatibility with other branches of the PLA forces, anti-submarine defense capabilities, long-range maritime operations, limited supply capabilities at sea, a restricted number of overseas bases, and challenges in training a substantial number of new sailors for the crews of the new ships, particularly in the absence of relative combat experience. Chinese naval personnel are aware of these limitations and actively strive to address them. The Chinese Navy has substantial reserves beyond its primary structure, with the Chinese Coast Guard being the largest in East Asia. This force functions as the rear or coastal component of the Navy, and under a centralized mobilization system, integrates a significant number of civilian fishing vessels. In assessing the two competing navies, it's important to consider the difference in ship types. The US Navy has a greater number of heavy ships, including aircraft carriers, guided missile cruisers, and destroyers, while the Chinese Navy possesses more light ships, such as frigates and corvettes armed with guided missiles. Additionally, US surface warships are equipped with an extensive 9,000 vertical launch missile launchers, whereas the Chinese Navy has approximately 1,000. American warships are technologically advanced. All US aircraft carriers are nuclear-powered, while the first 3 Chinese aircraft carriers utilize conventional propulsion. All American submarines are nuclear-powered, while most Chinese submarines use diesel propulsion. The majority of Chinese submarines are best suited for coastal operations rather than extended ocean voyages. Anti-ship ballistic missiles are a key asset in China's naval capabilities in a potential conflict with the US. The Chinese missile forces are armed with 2 types of medium-range anti-ship ballistic missiles, the DF-21D, with a range exceeding 932 miles, and the DF-26, with a maximum range of approximately 2,485 miles. Both systems are deployed on specialized mobile launchers. Moving on, which one of these countries has the upper hand when it comes to strategic positioning? In a hypothetical scenario where the United States attempts to conquer China independently, geographical factors come to the forefront as crucial determinants of the conflict's outcome. The longer the duration of the war, the more apparent China's geographical advantages become. China's vast land border, spanning 13,954 miles with neighboring countries, poses a significant challenge to potential US efforts to enforce an economic maritime blockade. This extensive border nullifies attempts to cut off maritime access effectively. Furthermore, China boasts the world's longest navigable waterways, totaling 68,350 miles. These waterways provide rapid mobility for various goods and military forces when conventional transportation infrastructure, such as roads and railways, fall short. In times of war, they serve as crucial routes for the movement of personnel, equipment, and supplies to critical areas. Conversely, the United States faces a considerable geographical distance from China. It's like half of the world. That would stretch its supply chains significantly, seriously impacting the dynamics of the conflict. Nonetheless, one favorable factor for a potential invasion is China's lengthy coastline, extending over 9,000 miles. A lengthy coastline necessitates a substantial commitment to homeland defense, as it provides open access to deep water sources. Many nations have, therefore, developed specialized coastal patrol craft and amphibious assault forces to mitigate concentrated sea-based attacks. A lengthy coastline requires dedicated defenses, which could potentially offer the US an advantage in terms of operational flexibility. Additionally, the concentration of most of China's human and material resources near the coastline could be advantageous for the US during the initial phases of an invasion. Thus, at the beginning of the war, the geography of China will be its disadvantage, which will eventually become a tangible advantage in the event of protracted attempts to conquer it. To comprehensively analyze this scenario, it's essential to delve deeper into the economic aspects as well. The United States, once the world's largest trading nation and a primary bilateral creditor, has seen a shift in global dynamics. Presently, nearly 100 nations consider China their foremost trading partner, while the United States maintains such a relationship with only 57 countries. China's influence has grown over the past decade, marked by a substantial commitment of $1 trillion to infrastructure projects through its Belt and Road Initiative. Whereas US aid contributions have diminished, the United States wields remarkable financial clout through its extensive transnational financial institutions and the global prominence of the US dollar. The majority of foreign exchange reserves are held in dollars, with only a small portion denominated in yuan. The US remains a frontrunner in the development of pivotal technologies, including bio, nano, and information technologies, that will be pivotal in this century's economic growth, although China has been making substantial efforts to establish formidable competition. Furthermore, the United States enjoys an advantageous position in terms of energy resources. Over the past decade, the shale revolution has transformed China into a net energy exporter, while China's reliance on energy imports has increased. Maintaining access to global resources during a conflict would be a significant advantage for the US, while China may require time to diversify its supply sources. Nevertheless, relying excessively on allies during a prolonged war could be a risky proposition. The cost of materials in the US National Defense Reserve has significantly decreased since 1952, by over 95%. In contrast, China's strategic reserves hold a considerably larger quantity of critical mineral resources. For example, China's strategic stockpiles contain approximately 7,000 metric tons of cobalt, whereas the US National Defense Reserves holds just over 300 metric tons, down significantly from more than 24,000 in 1990. This may lead to an underestimation of the critical mineral reserves required for stockpiling, considering the potential duration of a US-China conflict. In the context of a short and intense war, the emphasis would likely be on replenishing ammunition, as constructing and deploying new platforms would be impractical before hostilities began. The ability to replenish resources, as demonstrated in the Russian-Ukraine conflict, holds substantial importance in such scenarios. One significant resource deficiency in China pertains to semiconductors, as the majority of these critical components are either imported or manufactured by foreign suppliers. Semiconductors, often referred to as the oil of the 21st century, serve as the foundational technology in a wide range of devices, including smartphones, satellites, and anti-missile defense systems. The intricate process of advanced chip manufacturing is among the most complex in the manufacturing industry, involving over 1,000 production stages and lasting 3 to 4 months. That's a long time for a war between such influential states. For Chinese economists, achieving semiconductor self-sufficiency is of paramount importance. China has established substantial investments in the semiconductor industry. However, it lags behind Taiwan by approximately a decade in several crucial areas. China's overarching goal is to establish what is known as a closed loop, where domestic companies would oversee every aspect of the sector, including raw materials, engineering, chip design, manufacturing, and assembly. Conversely, the United States maintains dominance in the semiconductor sector, primarily due to its leadership in research, development, and design. How clever they are. The US has largely outsourced the production of advanced chips, primarily to Taiwan. Over time, the US share of global semiconductor production has decreased significantly, from 37% in 1990 to approximately 12%. In the event of a conflict between the United States and China, Taiwan's specialization in chip manufacturing would exacerbate global challenges. If China refrains from attacking Taiwan, the United States would have a significant advantage by maintaining Taiwan as a crucial ally. If China attacks, it will be another impetus to the world financial crisis that will arise due to the war. It's also important to understand that the US and China are each other's largest trading partners. A war between them would have a huge impact on the economies of both countries and the world. Now it's time to analyze the last important factor in the war: potential allies. Here's another consideration to keep in mind when contemplating a conflict. Who are your allies? Given the current global landscape, the United States faces a challenge in concentrating all its efforts solely on China. Various hotspots around the world and unresolved conflicts necessitate US presence and influence. Resources are also allocated to support the defense capabilities of countries such as Ukraine, NATO member states, Israel, Japan, Taiwan, and others. However, it remains uncertain whether these nations would be inclined to directly engage in a conflict with China and provide military support unless they were directly threatened. Can the US really trust their allies? In contrast, China holds an advantage over its potential adversaries, as many of the US's opponents possess substantial military forces, weaponry, and access to natural resources. A protracted conflict could unpredictably escalate tensions worldwide, draining the resources of the United States and its allies, and potentially expanding into a broader and more extensive conflict. Economically, the US's allies wield significant influence, but the global financial crisis that could arise in the wake of a conflict's onset makes it challenging to predict the extent of their support. An intriguing question pertains to whether the United States has allies within China, individuals or groups dissatisfied with China's policies, such as the Uyghurs. The strength of the Chinese system during times of war, the potential for elite collusion, and the possibility of capitulation all remain uncertain. It's also difficult to anticipate the feasibility and consequences of political assassinations of leaders in both the USA and China, and how such events would alter the course of the conflict. Conversely, democratic institutions in the United States have consistently demonstrated resilience. Simultaneously, strong pacifist and isolationist movements within the US can exert pressure on the government to seek an earlier end to the conflict. Therefore, predicting the domestic and global reactions to this conflict is difficult. If, in our theoretical case, the USA would like to conquer China, then time will not play in their favor. So, can the US conquer China on its own? The answer is probably not. Despite the superiority of many types of modern weapons, the USA will not be able to do this on its own. Even in an alliance with other NATO countries, this will be difficult because of the advantages that a defending country receives and the huge resources China has to do so. Do you think this might change in the future? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. A superpower can be defined as a state with the ability to project power or exert influence on a global scale, usually in more than one region at a time. The United States has been the world's sole superpower since the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, holding an unrivaled degree of economic and military dominance around the globe. Even today, with the rise of China, the US still remains by far the most powerful country, still far outstripping competitors in national power. It still has 3 times China's wealth and 5 times its military capabilities. And that's not to mention its enormous advantages in geography, demographics, and more. All things considered, it doesn't seem likely that the US is losing its status as global hegemon anytime soon. But hypothetically, what would happen if America found itself in a conflict against the entire rest of the world? Would the country still have the power to achieve victory, or would it be worn down and defeated? Today, we'll take a closer look at these questions, with a USA versus the world wargame. First, it goes without saying that such a scenario is extremely unlikely, if not downright impossible, during our lifetimes. Because of its diplomatic and economic ties around the world, as well as its huge arsenal of nuclear weapons, the US has almost entirely removed the possibility of real war with Europe and many other countries. But playing out the remote possibility still shows us a lot about US power and how it might look in the coming years. For the purpose of this video, we'll exclude nuclear weapons and assume that such a conflict would break out after a period of heightened global tensions rather than as a surprise attack. So who would really matter? The biggest challenges to the US in terms of actual military capability would certainly be China. Western European nations would be a close second, as they are wealthy and have stockpiles of advanced weapons and technology. While Russia, once considered to be America's main military challenger, its invasion of Ukraine has made clear that the country is something of a paper tiger, especially if its nuclear stockpile is out of the equation. India is another potential player, with the world's largest population and substantial military hardware. Together, China, Russia, India, and Europe account for the majority of the world's military spending outside of the US. In our hypothetical, let's say these countries all align against the US, with the rest of the world primarily contributing materiel or financial support. While this is extremely simplified, the fact of the matter is that most countries do not have the resources to project power beyond their borders or immediate region, making an attack on the US impossible. So let's say war breaks out. The first major difficulty with a global offensive against the US would be geographic. Surrounded by water on 2 sides, and Mexico and Canada to the north and south, any physical attack against the US would face major challenges. First, it would mean mounting either an enormous amphibious assault from one of the coasts or attempting to invade via land. But the deserts in the southwest and the Great Lakes in the Midwest insulate the country's major population centers from a potential invasion staged from Canada and Mexico. An invasion from outside North America would require massive fronts and long supply chains across the Pacific or Atlantic Oceans, leading to a dramatic reduction of overall power projection. Military expert Dylan Lurk has noted that even the largest amphibious assault in history on either the west coast or the east coast would be too insignificant to acquire an effective beachhead. If every foreign power managed to coordinate such a massive operation, and do so while remaining undetected under the enormous reach and power of the American intelligence apparatus, it would still have issues building up a force of any significant size before being pushed back into the sea. In addition, the strategic Hawaiian island chain acts as a gateway to the US mainland for attacks from the Pacific, and is protected by a significant military presence. Similarly, military installations in Alaska provide protection against any invasion from along the Arctic or Northwest. An attack from Mexico would probably be more feasible due to the Great Lakes blocking much of the Canadian border. But California and Texas have the largest concentration of defense industries and military bases in the country, thus providing an effective deterrent from any attack, with the southwestern desert spanning the 2 regions. The Southwest is also home to multiple heavily armed military bases, such as the White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico or NORAD headquarters in Colorado. An attack launched from Canada on the Midwest or the West would be limited to light infantry and would likely fail to take over population centers or other important strategic points, since there is mostly rural farmland and unpopulated national parks along the border, along with air bases located hundreds of miles south. Dr. Beckley makes this point as well, stating that the United States is a natural economic hub and military fortress. It's packed with resources and has more economic arteries like navigable waterways and ports than the rest of the world combined. And even if the US military was unable to stop an invasion, the huge diversity of terrain would also provide US military personnel or militias with the ability to conduct guerrilla warfare. The US is also by far the most heavily armed civilian population in the world, with a staggering 120 guns for every 100 people. This means that even if a coalition of other countries was able to actually get troops into the US, it would end up facing an incredibly well-armed and pissed-off insurgency. On the other hand, over the past 80 years, the US has developed a worldwide infrastructure of military bases, supply lines, and the world's largest air and naval transport fleets. This contains hundreds of ships and aircraft, more than the entire fleet of most countries. The lack of global mobility would be an enormous issue for any coalition facing the US. In the weeks before the sort of global conflict in our hypothetical, the US would most likely pull its forces out of the most vulnerable, non-American bases in Europe, Asia, and the Pacific, concentrating its resources in places where the US exercises greater territorial control to act as staging areas. Some areas would be considered too important to abandon, especially those supporting the military's supply chain, US oil assets, and key territorial choke points. One of the first battlefields in any conflict between the US and the rest of the world would be the Middle East. Here, one major aim of the DoD, as carried out by US Central Command, would be to secure critical US oil refineries and distribution centers, as well as gain control of the sea lanes used for transporting oil out of the region. As of 2022, 80.4% of the world's oil reserves are located in countries belonging to the international oil cartel OPEC, and 67.1% of OPEC reserves are in the Middle East. Similarly, over 60% of the world's oil passes through shipping lanes in the Arabian Sea alone. While the US has reduced its presence in the region in recent years, a global conflict would almost certainly cause a reorientation. Possessing the world's 12th largest oil reserves means that the US could theoretically go self-sufficient in wartime, but control of some Middle Eastern reserves would make guaranteeing its supply much easier. Similarly, it would allow the US to deny oil to much of the rest of the world and undermine the coalition's economies and military production. Europe, which would represent the US's most significant adversary, receives a significant amount of its crude oil and natural gas from the Middle East. This means that US military control of the region would harm Europe's ability to sustain a war effort for any extended period of time. China would face a similar issue, as over half of all its oil comes from the Middle East, making the region among one of the most likely fronts in a global war with the US. At the start of the conflict, the US would first strike at oil-related facilities across the Middle East, using carrier-based strike aircraft plus medium and long-range ballistic missiles. US power projection means that even without bases in Afghanistan, the military could easily hit targets anywhere from the Mediterranean to the Strait of Hormuz. While regional powers could offer some resistance, none of them have anywhere close to the manpower or firepower needed to stop the US in an all-out war. While Israel, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and several others do have modern fighter jets and other weaponry, even they would not last very long up against the might of the DoD. And because each is an independent country, intelligence and resource sharing among them would also be limited, further reducing the region's ability to stand up to the US in a shooting war. Most of their assets' signals would also likely be jammed by America's powerful electronic warfare capabilities, which would disrupt enemy communications, targeting, and guidance systems across the region. The greatest threat to US control of the Middle East in our scenario comes from ground-based air defenses, as even older systems can shoot unsuspecting fighter jets from the sky. However, unlike Russia's recent experience in Ukraine, the US has actually proven that it can effectively destroy another nation's air defense network, as it did during Desert Storm in the 1990s. Today, this might be even easier due to the enormous arsenal of drones the US has access to. Most US losses in the air would likely come from such drones, as well as fourth-generation jets like the F-15, while its more modern F-18s and F-22s could evade all but the best air defense systems. After establishing air superiority, the US would then work to control all choke points into and out of the region, especially the easily blocked Suez Canal, where over 12% of global trade passes through. If it was able to effectively keep regional control over the Middle East and its resources, the US would have a decent shot at winning against the rest of the world. A second major battlefield would be the Pacific, where the US would probably use its fleet to keep China and other East Asian nations contained and stop them from attacking the West Coast. This could mean either a blockade of major trade and supply routes, as well as using islands like Hawaii and Guam to stage its own offensives. It would also utilize its fleet of aircraft carriers heavily in the Asia-Pacific region. As of this video, there are 47 aircraft carriers around the world. The largest 11 of these are all nuclear-powered carriers belonging to the US, which have more than twice the combined total deck space of every other country combined. The Pacific Fleet fields 7 of these, and in a global war could use them to deny access to anything approaching the US mainland. Again, oil would be another top concern, and the US could use its massive navy to gain control of the Strait of Malacca, which carries up to 40% of the world's trade every year. While less easily choked off than the Suez Canal, a US blockade of this waterway would also devastate most economies in Asia, giving the US serious economic leverage over China, India, and others. The US would also likely exert its naval power in the South China Sea, which it could use to launch strikes against China, Japan, the Philippines, or any other regional power. Heavy fighting would ensue across the sea and air domains all around the South China Sea, and could account for the heaviest US casualties in any theater of this hypothetical war. Another potential target is Taiwan, where over 90% of the world's advanced microchips are currently fabricated. The US might even need to seize and try to occupy the island to stop the global coalition from dominating the production of modern electronics. To do so, the US would inevitably have to challenge China as well. Chinese air defenses and ballistic missile capabilities are already powerful alone, and if combined with the assets of every other country in the region, could potentially pose a problem for the US. The naval base on Guam would be especially vulnerable to strikes by ballistic missiles, which could overwhelm its limited air defenses. Even so, the US Navy is so powerful that every country in the East Pacific combined would be occupied with fending it off, and probably could not launch their own strikes on the US mainland. And because the US Navy is larger than those of the next 8 countries combined, it could easily fight in 2 or 3 theaters at once, making simultaneous blockades of Europe, the Middle East, and Asia Pacific a real possibility. Another aspect of a global war would involve submarines, which unsurprisingly the US has more of than almost anyone else. Its fleet contains 53 fast attack submarines, 14 nuclear-capable ballistic missile subs, and 4 guided missile subs. Even without using the world-ending nuclear capabilities of an Ohio-class submarine, this massive fleet would allow the US to launch stealth attacks on enemy naval vessels anywhere in the world, completely undetected. While America would be far more hard-pressed to fend off a global coalition on the ground, at sea, the US stands a much better chance of victory. A third global area of battle would be the Americas, where the US would have the greatest ability to marshal forces and project power. And because Mexico, Canada, and other countries in the region are far less powerful, there is a good chance the US could blockade, control, or destroy the majority of their military and economic resources. Canada and Venezuela are both obvious targets because of their status as oil producers, and in a global war the US would probably aim to shut down or take control of resources in both. Another obvious target is the Panama Canal, which serves as the gateway between the Atlantic and Pacific, and where 40% of all US container shipping flows through. The US controlled the canal from 1903 to 1979, and would try to seize it again during a global war. This would also provide a choke point against the militaries of Central and South America. Chile is another potential target as the country supplies 28% of the world's copper, critical for the production of modern electronics. Now, obviously, a hypothetical alliance of every other country in the world would have the numerical advantage in overall troops and economic resources. But keep in mind that as of 2022, US military spending was $877 billion, constituting 40% of the global total and more than the next 10 countries combined. Today, this enormous sum still only accounts for about 3% of the country's GDP. In a global war, this percentage would almost certainly increase and could rise to similar levels as World War II, when US military spending accounted for over 40% of national GDP. Today, that would mean somewhere close to $10 trillion a year in military spending from the US alone, nearly 5 times the global total from 2022. Astronomical numbers like these mean that a war of attrition against America would also be likely to fail, as the country could outspend the rest of the world several times over for many years. To gain a true strategic edge over the US, a global coalition would have to somehow outgun and outspend the Defense Department, while also maintaining their own smaller economies. Another crucial domain in a global conflict with the US would play out in cyberspace. This would probably be the first line of contact between the warring parties, as both sides would attempt to gain information superiority and take each other's systems offline. While US Cyber Command would almost certainly be overwhelmed with attacks by many actors at once, America could also use its own highly effective attacks to shut down enemy power grids, computer networks, weapons, electronics, and much more. And while it's not as dominant in cyberspace as in the real world, the US still has by far the most capable and best-funded capabilities in the world. In the 2024 fiscal year, US cyber spending will rise to more than $25 billion, and the country continues to top every ranking of national cyber power. However, this domain would also be one of the biggest dangers to the US in a global war, as cyber attacks are notoriously difficult to predict and defend against. A well-placed cyber attack by a less powerful nation could still be catastrophic, and would probably be a more serious immediate threat to US citizens than a kinetic strike on the country. However, again, we have no way of knowing how much American cyber spending would increase in a total war, or how quickly that would lead to new capabilities. All the elements point to a big conclusion. The US is so powerful that it could take on the rest of the world for weeks or months with no certain winner. Because of this, such a hypothetical conflict would likely become a war of attrition in both the physical and digital worlds. The US would work to starve the world's other major powers of oil, war supplies, and other vital resources, while attempting to preserve its own. A true assault on the US mainland would be extremely difficult because of the country's size, geographic positioning, and incredibly well-armed military and civilian population. Because of the US military's global presence, most of the fighting would likely happen elsewhere, opening theaters of war everywhere from the Middle East to South America and East Asia. In the end, the victor would almost certainly be whichever side could outlast the other, both in terms of military and economic resources. While the scenario of America versus the entire world is obviously an absurd one, it does give us a useful picture of just how powerful the US military really is. With resources greater than those of most individual countries and nearly limitless power projection, even a conventional conflict against the US would be very hard to achieve true victory. Add in the country's continued dominance in cyberspace, and it's not all clear whether the rest of the world would actually be able to win such a war. And all of the speculation above excludes the most powerful part of the equation: nuclear weapons. Because of the principle of mutually assured destruction, no country really wants to use them today. However, it's worth noting that the US has over 1,400 actively deployed nukes, and in any real global conflict, they could be used to give any non-nuclear country a very permanent end. And even in a very distant hypothetical like the one above, we should remember that the cost of human life in any worldwide conflict would be staggering, and that even winners in such a war would suffer. But what do you think? Would the US really be able to win a war against the rest of the world? Or would the country eventually be overwhelmed? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more military content and analysis.